Our guest this week, week 12 of 13, needs no introduction, so of course I'm going to talk for 20 minutes. This is Richard Garriott, one of my mentors and one of the higher profile guys, much deservedly so, in this entire business. He started out as a child.
Don't look at these. Don't look at these.
With an artist mom and an astronaut dad, and a penchant for crossbows and leather. I'll tell you, we'll probably get into this at some point too, but I remember the first time I met Richard, it was probably 1983, 84, I guess. You probably don't even remember, because I was one of the little peons at Steve Jackson Games. I was an assistant editor. I was making minimum wage. It was my first game job. And we were all driving these beater cars and everything, and in drove this rock star in his Mitsubishi Turbo Eclipse, I believe it was, all black. Got out all black, bling everywhere, and I was thinking, okay, I'm in the wrong line of work. I got to find a way to work with this guy. But started out really as a kid on Akalabeth, learning to program, learning to make games as he did so. With Akalabeth, and that was after that. Basically, started from scratch, rewrote everything, and did the first Ultima game, which was reissued several years later. Junked everything again, and figured, hey, I'll learn how to write assembly language, and did Ultima II with a bunch of guys who are also far older now than they were back then. Ultima III, which I believe was the first Origin game, and we'll talk about that. And still with that impeccable fashion sense. Ultima IV, a seminal moment, I mean, certainly for me. This is a game that always makes my top 10 list, and convinced me that games could really be something much more special than they were. So this was a game that changed things. Ultima V, this was the game that convinced me, okay, I really need to work with this guy. We shared a panel together at ArmadilloCon, a local science fiction convention, and I got a demo, and frankly, I was working with the guys at SSI who were doing the TSR games, the gold box game. Well, they weren't even gold box then, but I just looked at what they were doing and what Richard was doing, thinking, oh my God, I got to get down here. Luckily I did, and got to work with them on this, which was kind of my grad school as a game developer, working with Richard on Ultima VI, and then Ultima VII, which from a graphical standpoint certainly changed things pretty dramatically. Ultima VIII, how the heck does he get pentagrams on his box covers? We'll talk about that. Actually, one of the other things I want to talk about is why this wasn't Diablo before Diablo was Diablo. And then changed the world again. I mean, if Ultima IV didn't do it quite enough, Ultima Online certainly did, creating an entirely new category of game from nothing over some rather remarkable opposition, if memory serves. And then refining. That was the hamster trail, actually. That right there, at the old Origin office. That right there. I remember the day I quit was the same day Chris Roberts quit, and we stood right about there, and people would show up at that end and this end, and they'd look at us and they'd go, oh, what's going on there? And they'd walk away, all scared of us. It was pretty cool. Ultima IX, fairly dramatic leap forward from a graphical standpoint. And then, as if that body of work wasn't enough, created with his brother Robert the company that created all of these. I didn't have room for everything on the screen, so I basically put up everything I worked on. Anyway. Oh, but wait, there's more. I don't know if I've worked on more Ultima games than you have, Richard. We'll have to duke that out sometime. But anyway, the Ultima series was not just the numbered ones, though those were clearly the heart of the franchise. There were just all these games. I mean, they all sort of came from this man's original vision when he was probably 16. It's kind of incredible. And then, sadly, came the end of Origin, which for many of us, including me. I mean, I really thought I was getting the gold watch from that company. I really wanted to stay there forever. But it just wasn't to be. This was one of the designers, I don't know if you've ever seen this, one of the designers who's still with me actually, as people left, would take that picture and put a red dot over people's faces. And ultimately everybody had a red dot, but this was a little earlier version. And then left to create destination games. So these are, some of these images are from the Origin
bonfire.
Wake, the bonfire. We created worlds. You gotta love that. But destination games didn't take long to arrive at the station because Richard went on to join NCSoft and set up their Austin studio, a Korean company. I'm not sure what was funny there, but okay, I'll take it.
My fashion sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. Or maybe it was some of your compadres here. I don't know. Or maybe it was you. I don't know. But NCSoft is still, I bet, the leading publisher of massively multiplayer online games in the world, with many titles to its credit. And what was it, a week ago, Tabula Rasa.
A few weeks ago.
A few weeks ago, okay, a few weeks ago, Tabula Rasa shipped, which many of us have been waiting a while for, probably mostly Richard. So, again, graphically pretty impressive. Have some character. They're still trying to kill you, Richard. I don't know what the deal is.
Hundreds of people at the same time.
Yeah. And I'd love to talk to you about this. There's something about languages going on in Richard's games. This one he created. This one was created for Ultima VI, which is the gargoyle language. This was from Serpent Isle. I mean, if we were going to do an Ultima game, even if it wasn't set in Britannia, we knew we had to create a crazy language, so there was one that came out of that. And then more recently, the Logos language from Tabula Rasa. And then, of course, there are the extracurricular activities, which just, I mean, I can't believe the man owns a Sputnik, for crying out loud.
2 now, actually.
Okay, 2. Can I have one? Oh, wait, anyway. But no, I mean, trips to the Antarctic, I don't do that. Trips into outer space, I don't do that either. Trips down to the Titanic, owning skeletons. I mean, going onto the Vomit Comet with Stephen Hawking. I mean, this is a crazy life you lead. And of course, many honors. This one bestowed by his mother and brother as he was inducted into the Hall of Fame, among many others. I mean, there's just too much to go into here. And then this is the Warren puts too much text on the screen thing, but you know, I guess either I learned the lessons really well, or we learned some stuff together, or boy, we are just a hive mind or something. But there's a lot of wisdom here for would-be designers. I mean, taking stuff out. We were talking just earlier today at the office about how design is as much about what you don't put in your game, what you take out, what you cut, as it is about what you include. Cohesiveness, I mean, hugely important thing. I would generalize this to say launching any game is generally a catastrophe. But this in particular sings to me. I mean, I use this example all the time. I don't know if I got it from you or not. But if you see a telephone on it, why put a telephone on a desk if it's just a prop? You should be able to use it. You know, if there's a cannon, you should be able to use it. And the importance of simulation as a design tool, very, very big. And then forget about this. It's the key thing here. Okay, to summarize this bit here. You know, most of the time, as a gamer, I mean, as the hero of a game, you're the good guy because you are told you're the good guy, and the bad guy is the bad guy because you are told he is bad. But you're the one who's raping and pillaging and causing all of the heartache in the land. Okay, I mean, go back and think about it. Every game you've ever played, that's basically the truth. And Richard's games in particular, and I know I've always found this inspiring, don't play that game. You know, they don't play that way. They're about why are you here, and they're about more than just killing a bad guy and saving the world. They're about you actually being a hero, which I find, I mean, important. And then of course there's the butt of many jokes, and just I had to put something in that called you a crazy son of a bitch, and you agree. So there you go. Now let's rewind all the way to the beginning and put up the embarrassing slides.
Oh, come on now. You can surely some slide other than that.
No, I really don't. come on, it's taken me a long time to get to the point where I can do this to you. Oh, and I need to get my stuff. All right. All right, so as usual, we're going to start with a little biography.
Sure.
So let's start at the beginning. Where were you born and raised, and what was your educational background?
Well, as some of you already know, my nom de plume that I've used periodically, the Lord British title, actually is a D&D nickname from the bygone era of when I used to play in high school. But it actually stuck as a nickname because I was actually born in Cambridge, England. So I actually really still have dual citizenship, U.S. and British citizenship. But of course, you may notice I don't have a British accent. That's because I grew up here in the United States. I only lived in England for about 2 months prior to my parents moving back. And I spent the first 5 years of my life out in California, where my dad was a professor at Stanford University. He was doing upper ionospheric physics and radio wave propagation during the time of Sputnik, which inspired him actually to apply to become an astronaut, which he was accepted as an astronaut in the first generation of scientist astronauts. And so that moved the family, and thus me, also down to Houston, where I lived just a few blocks from the entrance to NASA, which of course was pretty influential on my upbringing as well, in that, as you mentioned, my two parents, my mother being an artist, got me very much interested in things like art and silversmithing and all kinds of stuff. So like the snake that some of you might be familiar with is kind of my personal icon. It was something I made as a 11-year-old that is now soldered on my neck. I didn't know how to make a clasp, so it's kind of a permanent part of me now. With my father being an astronaut, he was constantly bringing home experiments, really cutting-edge pieces of technology and apparatus that I was constantly playing with. And there were things like, I remember one time he brought home what was described to us as a photomultiplier tube, which you would now know as a night vision scope. But this was before night vision scopes existed, and so but we would have a little lens from a telescope sit in the back of this and run around through the backyard chasing our cats through the bushes. Decades before anybody had ever heard or seen of such technology. So that blend of art from my mother and technology from my dad really inspired me to get really, I think, into the core of this business.
You're answering all the questions I was going to get to. This is awesome. So when did you first discover games as a player and fan?
Well, of course, as a pre-high school, I would play board games, Monopoly and those sort of things like anybody else would. But it was really my sophomore year in high school that I was exposed to what I think are the three biggest influences from a gaming and standpoint. One was actually a book, The Lord of the Rings. That's when I'd never really read much fantasy prior to that, or read much of anything really prior to that, or since.
Yeah, we'll talk about that too.
But also Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons was first published in '74, if my memory serves. But I was playing it starting in 1977, which was still pretty early in the 3 saddle-stitched book days. Prior to advanced D&D, etc.
At the same time I discovered it.
And also Steve Jackson games too, of course. But then also computers. That was when I first was exposed to computers, pretty much at the exact same time. Computers weren't personal computers; they were teletypes and other forms at the time. But those 3 things happening really at the exact same time started me on this path of doing, experiencing both as a player and as a creator. All happened really concurrently.
So now there couldn't have been a computer science department at your high school, and there couldn't have been a computer lab. Really, I mean, it was, as you say, it was before personal computers. So how did you actually get your hands on a computer, and how did you convince the folks at your school to let you make games on these crazy gigantic pieces of equipment that required guys in white lab coats?
Yeah, in fact, at the high school I was going to, they had exactly one computer terminal connected with an acoustic modem to an off-site PDP-11. And a second teletype used to punch paper tape that you could then read into the one that was connected to the computer. And that was the total computing of the school. And I had a class where I had a math class where that terminal was in the classroom, and had in a previous summer had been exposed to computers in the summer kind of summer school thing that I went to. And so I already had an interest in them, even before I went back to my regular high school for the year. And through high school, another thing I had commonly done is I was a big fan, and still a big fan, of science fairs. as an extracurricular activity, and I entered every year from my kindergarten year up through my graduation from high school. And since I was a regular competitor, you also could probably guess that over time I became a pretty good competitor in the sense of I took it pretty seriously, and I put a lot of effort in these projects. And so I would also often would win awards in science fair.
You won the national science fair one year?
I won first place in school, district, regional, and then went to international and got fourth place in international with my senior year project. But which actually was a 2-year-long project. So my junior year project continued into my senior year project. So it was a big project. But through science fair, I got to know the faculty really well. So I knew the principal of the school well. I knew the science and math teachers really well, and they also knew that I was a reasonably self-motivated individual. And so in my sophomore year, when I saw that computer terminal, I said, I'd love to have access to the computer terminal, but there was no class that did anything with this terminal. It was basically sitting unused through the year. I convinced the school to let me have my own class with no teacher, no curriculum, no grades, and all I had to do was at the beginning of the year tell them what I was going to do, which was make games, and at the end of the year show them what I had done, and they would grant me a grade. And they counted it as my foreign language credit because I never took a foreign language in high school. They counted basic as a foreign language, and so that's what I did for 3 years of high school. Was had my own class, my whole classroom with no teacher, no grades, no curriculum.
That's a talent that has stood you in good stead for many years. I used to say that Richard could change reality through the force of will. Just through the force of personal charisma. And apparently that was in evidence when you were in high school. That's amazing. I mean, I saw that in action many, many times. There was another influence on your early career, at least it seems to me, that the SCA, the Society for Creative Anachronism, was a big part of your life back then, too.
Yeah, that actually started when I left Houston and came here to Austin to come to college. And so when I enrolled here at UT, which was in 1979, one of the first things I did is went down to the UT Student Center and was hanging out there and saw these strange people dressed up kind of like I was right there. In fact, that's me in the SCA right there. Saw these people out, in some hall back in the back, hitting each other hard with big rattan sticks and all wearing plate armor, and I just thought that was one of the craziest things I'd ever seen. And of course, I was already writing these simple little fantasy games, so I of course had some attraction to it. And so I began to, live action role play, you might say, with SCA folks. And interestingly, as you probably are well aware, a lot of those individuals who I met here in Austin became the actual characters in the Ultima series. And most of them still live here in town. And so for those of you who are Ultima familiar, who might remember people like Yolo the Bard, who in the game also was a crossbow maker. Well, he really lives here in town. His real name is David Watson, and his real job is a crossbow maker. And that's really what he does for a living, and he's kind of a crazy old coot, and would agree with me if you heard me say it. And so a lot of the inspiration for the actual characters and events and dialogue in the Ultima series, especially those early Ultimas, really were drawn directly out of real people here in Austin.
Yeah, you were Greg Dykes was Dupre, right?
Greg Dykes was Dupre.
And he was a knight, and you were.
Well, I had two characters. I was not only Lord British, but I was also Shamano, for those of you, if you remember all the characters. And Mariah the Wizard, the mage, is my assistant, Michelle Cadell, who's still my assistant after 25 plus years. Jeffrey the Giant was Jeff Hillhouse, who still works with us at Origin and then now at NCSoft. Basically, all those characters are still around.
Oh, it's going to be hard to stay on track and just not turn this into Old Home Week. Okay. So how and when did you get your first home computer, and what was it? And we actually just sort of skipped over by this.
Well, this is part of that story, actually. So, when, trying to write a game, something as complicated as a game, on a teletype was very difficult. There's no video display. It was all, if you guys are familiar with teletypes, it's a mechanical keyboard. They were capable of punching paper tape strips. In fact, this paper tape strip happens to be the first game that I wrote on that machine. This is actually the original copy of it as well. And you might be able to see there's rows of holes on this. There's actually a small hole, which is the kind of the alignment marker on it, and then there's 8 other holes, 8 bits for an ASCII character. And whenever you type the letter A, it would just punch the holes for the ASCII character letter A, and etc. Each character you would type. And by the way, that means if you make a typo, you're in real trouble because you can't back up and unpunch holes. So to type in a program required you, first of all, to really plan it out ahead of time. So I'd write all these programs out in notebooks, with the line numbers, line number 10, begin, etc. in BASIC. Then after you had basically run the program in your mind many times, you would then attempt to type out a high-quality piece of paper tape, which often took multiple steps to get this right. Then you would read that into the expensive part was when you actually had live connection to the offsite machine, and so they didn't want you just to leave that port open, so to speak. So you'd eventually, after you got a good paper tape strip, you would read it in through this acoustic terminal, and then you'd attempt to run it. And of course, running it was often fraught with failure, as lots of programming tasks are. The debugging tools and processes, of course, were beyond primitive, you might say, to try to create a working game. And when I was working on this first game, my dad actually made a bet with me. He saw the scale of this project that I was putting together, because I was making a full fantasy role-playing game with a dungeon to go explore and treasure and monsters and all kinds of things you could do to interact with it. Which is far more complicated than the little bits of gaming that you might describe that were taking place at the time were very, very simple in comparison. And so my dad said, Richard, by the way, I think you have no hope of making this thing work. He says, I'll make you a bet though. He says, to encourage you to do your best on it, if you get this program, type it in, and within a couple of days of debugging for typos, it works, I will split the cost with you for an Apple II computer, which at the time was like $3,000. And so I therefore sat I did this I ran that program in my mind many times, was very careful, got the program written up, typed in, and a little bit of debugging, and that's actually also what earned me my Apple II.
So let's talk about those notebooks for a second. So this is when you were calling it D&D 1, D&D 2.
That's right.
So what
this
was
is D&D
that?
1.
Wow.
So this is D&D 1, and so in fact, even through high school, that first notebook and this exact spool of tape was D&D. Since I was playing D&D at the time, I just called it D&D 1. Then I would make another notebook, which I started out as D&D 2, D&D 3, D&D 4, D&D 5, etc. Some of them were never typed in. Sometimes I'd get halfway through it, realize some fundamental aspect of the structure improvements I was making was not going to work, and I would just abandon the notebook and move on to the next iteration. So the numbering isn't exactly how many there really were, but my numbering actually went up to number 28. So I had up to the last one I actually did in high school was called D&D 28, and that's when I finally had access to the Apple II that my dad and I purchased. And as soon as I had the Apple II, suddenly there was a whole new aspect of real-time interaction that became possible. Because if you think about a teletype, surprisingly, this game looked a lot like Ultima. It had asterisks for walls, spaces for corridors, dollar signs for treasure. A capital letter meant, like a capital A was the giant ant, an X for a door, and a U for up ladder, D for down ladder, etc. And every time you'd make a move, you had to wait for about 40 seconds as it typed out the entire next scene. Then you would go north, and you have to wait. But otherwise, it was alphanumeric graphics, but otherwise it was still basically a tile graphic game like you might be more familiar with in the Ultima series. But as soon as I had access to the Apple II not only responded in real time with a video display, but there was a simple little game that I had seen. The very first simple game I saw was called Escape. And it was a game where you actually got to watch a maze be drawn in kind of top-down block graphics, and then it would drop you in it in 3D and let you just find your way out of the maze. And that was the end of the game. And immediately, as soon as I realized I saw something drawn in perspective, and this was in block graphics, it wasn't even in line-drawn graphics. It was very, very, very low res. But that made me immediately realize that, hey, I can actually now create my worlds in 3D too. And I sat down and...
Unfortunately, this has now died, so we're stuck on this screen.
Oh,
for the rest
rats!
of the time.
Not this screen. Anything but this screen. So that's when I finally had access to that Apple II. I sat down with my mother, who was an artist, and she showed me how she drew perspective about how you make telephone poles along the side of a road, and how to know where the next telephone pole will be and how tall that next telephone pole will be from a geometry standpoint. Then I sat down and said, I was reasonably good with geometry, so I worked out mathematically what that would look like, or at least what I did, what I thought was my best job, although for at the time in high school, it was still fairly advanced calculations for me. So actually, before I even programmed that, I went to my dad and I said, hey, can you check my math on this? He went from a completely different approach, came with it, from a derivatives and integrals approach, but ended up with basically the same equations. And so that's when I realized, yes, thank you, the bottom left and bottom right pictures, where I could calculate the points that I would need to reach with the vertices to draw a game and draw graphics in perspective. And so those were hand calculated, hand drawn, still in BASIC, calls to plot each of those little line segments, one line segment at a time. And that game that I was basically took D&D 28, and on the Apple II I called it D&D 28B, because the only difference in my mind was that it now had perspective view versus the top-down view. And I was doing this in my senior year in high school, and I was at that same time I was working as a sales clerk at a Computerland store. And what was funny is that back in the day, of course, I think again the Apple IIs were about $3,000 a piece. They didn't do much, and if you're trying to sell them, what most people were buying them ostensibly for, paying this quite a large sum of money, especially for even back in those days, as you were to balance your checkbook or to keep your do maybe some word processing, and maybe they would even try to sell it to women to keep your cookbook recipes and things in. I mean, it was really things you can't imagine spending that kind of money on, plus a few games. And it was the owner of the Computerland store who saw this game that I had made, who said, hey Richard, this little game that I see you working on in the back of the store is much better than all the games we're selling here on the wall of the store. And not only that, but this is, the state-of-the-art packaging is a Ziploc bag. He said, why don't you go next door to the convenience store, buy some Ziploc bags, and put some of your games on the wall, and we'll sell them here. And so that's what I did. And so I went out and bought some Ziploc bags. I invested, my total investment in this game was about $200, which for me was all the money I had in the world at the time. I made some Xerox cover sheets at a print shop that was just a couple doors down in one direction. Bought the Ziploc bags, hand copied some discs on the Apple II that I owned. Made this little instruction booklet that we stapled together in the kitchen of my mom's house. And we started hanging these on the pegboard at the Computerland store. And they sold very well. And in the first week or so, we sold a dozen or two copies of this game, when all of a sudden I got a call from California. So one of the copies of this original game had already been pirated and copied and cheated and stolen across the country. And
never change.
yeah. Piracy has been rampant since the beginning. And a publisher out in California, or a distributor in California, who was called California Pacific, called me up and said, hey Richard, we'd really like to take your game and distribute it nationally. And so they flew me to California. I signed contracts, and they put it in a bigger Ziploc bag. I was charging $20 for mine. They charged $35 for their bigger Ziploc bag, but otherwise it's pretty much the same. And when they distributed this nationally, this game sold about 30,000 copies. My royalties were about $5 per sale, and if you do that math, that's about $150,000 when I was still a senior in high school. For a game that took me about 6 weeks of my after-school time, and I paid myself $0, of course. So the return on investment is basically infinite. And by the way, it has been downhill ever since, and still is to this day. It gets harder and harder each time. But this game wasn't meant to be published, and that's kind of what you'd kind of alluded to in your intro, where after I did this one that did really well, even though I wasn't trying to sell anything, that's when I started over and wrote a game called Ultima, which was the first game I meant that I intended to be published.
So at this point, Did you have any concept of play testing, or did you have your friends play it? I mean, how did California Pacific have any testing, or was it just, hey, it's kind of cool, let's put it out there?
Pretty much the latter.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, of course, my friends were playing it, and I was playing it. I mean, I was showing it off to friends to play it, but we weren't. We didn't have any process like, hey, we're about to go manufacture 1,000 of these, so let's please make sure there's no bugs, and go through a testing process. And there was nothing like that.
Okay. Oh, this really is officially dead now. That's really annoying. Okay. Well, I'm sorry to people working the camera. So then, hold on. Well, actually, let's talk about UT for a minute. So you were working on Ultima at that point?
So Ultima I wrote in high school.
Houston?
No, Ultima 1, no, excuse me, you're right.
Yeah.
Akalabeth I wrote while I was in high school. Ultima 1 I wrote here in Austin when I was driving back and forth from home. And there was this funny thing that occurred. And so this is one of those cautionary tales of don't follow this advice. Because for me, as my income level went up, my grade point average went down. And there was, I made it through 2.5 years here at UT. And I was in my junior year, and I was finally taking some actual programming classes. And the programming class I was taking in my junior year was, at the time, it was a 6809 assembly class. And a 6809 was the sequel to the 6502. And so every night I would go home to work on, at the time it was Ultima II, and Ultima II was my very first assembly language program ever. And so, but since I was writing a massive project on a 6502 code, I learned 6502 coding very well. On the other hand, I would go to my 1 hour or a couple hours per week class, which was in 6809 assembly, which had extra instructions on this new processor. But I could never remember the extra instructions. And whenever I would be graded, I was always graded on how efficiently you would write the code that would include necessarily the more efficient instructions of the new processor. And so I would always write it basically in 6502 code, which would work fine but not be optimal. And so I started flunking my 6809 class, even though I really could do the work quite well. And that was my kind of heads up that these two activities weren't compatible. And so it was actually a very, it sounds like an easy decision, but it was really a very difficult decision to drop out of school to go play games for a living. And especially because, in my family I have a painfully overeducated family. My dad was a professor at Stanford, has multiple doctorate degrees. My mother has her master's degree in art. My eldest brother is a medical doctor. My next older brother, who's my business partner, has multiple master's degrees. My younger sister has master's degrees. And I've dropped out of school to play games for a living. And so it was a tough call, but it was funny how the decision went, because it kind of became this family issue, where we'd be at home talking about it. And I think it was pretty obvious to everybody in the family that these two goals were not compatible. And the financial success of Ultima I, which was 5 to 10 times better already than Akalabeth was from a revenue standpoint. So even I was already making many times more than my dad was making as an astronaut, and so everybody in the family was already going, well, hey, we get it. It's probably the right decision to go do this. But surely it's going to be a windfall. Surely this industry won't last. Surely this will become this is some fluke that is allowing you to do this incredibly lucrative activity. And so when that goes away, you can go back to school, get a degree, get a real job. And that day has still never come.
And probably won't. So how much of the ongoing Ultima lore was in place in these early games? I mean, did you have the companions, Lord British, the World of Britannia, and all those well-known towns? I mean, was that part of this?
No, in fact, the earliest Ultimas really were an amalgamation of everything that I thought was cool in the few books that I'd read, the many movies I'd seen, or the few other games that I played, all thrown into one game. And it was pretty much anything, for example, if you look at Ultima I, the world it takes place in is called Caesarea, which was my D&D world. In fact, it was literally, the map was my D&D world map that I'd been working on. Then I saw the movie Time Bandits. And Time Bandits had this really cool cloth map and this concept of time travel in it that I thought was really cool. And so if you look at Ultima II, it's really got a lot of Time Bandits influence in it. That's where I got the cloth maps. That's where I got time travel, the moon gates, all that stuff really came from Time Bandits. Then for Ultima III, I went back, and by the way, Ultima II, because it had the concept of time travel, you have to have a context for time travel. And so you have to have a context for the past and the future. So Ultima II takes place on Earth, because that way you at least understand there's dinosaurs in the past and there's spaceships in the future. But then when I got around to doing Ultima III, which didn't include time travel, I went back to my D&D world of Caesarea. And it wasn't until Ultima IV that I really sat down and kind of changed tactics a little bit, where when I wrote Akalabeth, of course I had no idea I was going to sell a game at all. When I wrote Ultima I, I had no idea there was going to be an Ultima II. Each time, in fact, it was always the motivation to start these games over was really a introspective game designer thought. For example, Akalabeth was like, Yahoo, I've got a personal computer that has graphics at all. Then the first Ultima was, wow, I can do a much better game if I write one that's intended for public consumption and actually has a goal to reach, which Akalabeth did not. Actually has a plot of any kind, or a goal or an aspiration. With Ultima II, it was wow, I've written these first couple games in BASIC, but if I really want to do something that's more, if I want to make something more powerful or go beyond what I've already done, I really should learn assembly, and that's why I wrote Ultima II, was to improve upon the first one by doing it in assembly. Then when I finished Ultima II, I went, wow, now I actually know assembly. Now that I'm finished with this game, I've finally learned assembly. So if I scrap that and start over again completely from scratch with Ultima III, I can do a much better game. So each Ultima really was a start over from scratch, purge all that I had done before, because I felt I was learning so quickly. And so there was really no connection between the very first few Ultimas up until 4.
So, and all of this was you teaching yourself stuff. I mean, are you going to books, or are you reading, Antic magazine, or how are you actually learning all this stuff?
No, at the very, very beginning. So back in the teletype days, there were magazines that I could type in programs on. I mean, if you look back at the early Byte magazines and some of these other magazines, there was often 1 or 2 page long programs you could type in to make something work. And so a lot of my very first programming was typing things in from magazines and seeing if they worked, and then seeing if they had typos in the magazine, or if you had a typo in putting it into the computer. But that's as close to formal training as I ever had, was typing in some early programs from magazines. Otherwise, completely self-taught.
And I'm a little confused on the timeline. Was it Ultima II? Was that the first time you actually worked with a team? At what point did you start saying, "Hey, I need to bring some other people in to help me out"? For the most part, all the way up through 4 was a solo work. The only exception to that is that on Ultima I, which is the first time I did tile graphics, the whole game is in BASIC, except a subroutine which copies a chunk of memory onto the screen to make a tile show up on the screen. And since that was something that needed to be in assembly, and I didn't know how to write assembly, and so I had a friend of mine who worked at that same Computerland store, a guy named Ken Arnold, who did know assembly, and so he wrote a very short subroutine for me that I could call to copy a tile onto the screen. But other than that assistance, all the way up through 4 was a completely solo endeavor. But somewhere in there, your brother got involved in your business, and you moved to New England. What was the series of events that led to that?
Yeah, so if you go back, to the earliest days, Akalabeth here. Akalabeth, in fact, these 2 big Ziploc bags, these were distributed by that first publisher I described, called California Pacific. Well, California Pacific was a prime example of a 1980s computer game distributor. As you might have garnered from some of the numbers I already described that was coming in through these products, this was what could easily be described as a free money era, which has a dark side associated with it from a business standpoint, which is that means that a lot of really dumb people can get into this business and still make money. And a lot of these California publishers, who were this first wave of publishers, were not only terrible business people, but they also tended to be frank and honest, tended to be heavy drug users, I will say. And in particular, this company basically put themselves out of business by, they kept the vast majority of the money from the sales of my games, and then squandered it, including on massive volumes of drugs for the key staff out there in California, and so basically, even though I gave them 2 games which were bestsellers in their day, they went out of business, and they went out of business owing me a substantial chunk of money. And so then I went to a second publisher. Second publisher also was heavily involved in a variety of extracurricular activities, including lots of drugs. Also ran out of money. Also quit paying me. And that's when I went to my brother Robert, who was just finishing up his second master's degree. And in fact, his second master's degree was in engineering economic systems, and he had been studying investments in the entertainment software business. So he'd been reading the business plans of these companies who were going out of business owing me money. And I would lean on my brother and say, Robert, can you help me try to collect from these bozos who are ripping me off? And every time he would go out there and we'd try to put the squeeze on them, and then they'd fold and go out of business, and it never worked. So he actually never helped me collect a penny.
Wow.
But by going through that process, he eventually actually approached me and said, Richard, I know the industry you're in very well now from studying it, plus you've invited me in to try to squeeze these guys to get some money out of these bozos who A, don't know business, and B, are stupid enough to squander your money. And he said, look, why don't we go into business together? At the very least, I won't squander your money, and I will pay you for everything I sell. And I said, well, hey, that sounds like a great deal to me. And that's what started Origin, was really that very simple reaction to the necessity or the desire to get paid for my work. And we were a classic garage startup when we started Origin. We literally were in my parents' 3-car garage. My mother had an art studio over the 3-car garage that we kicked her out of. And upstairs, there were really 2 rooms. One room was Robert's business office. The bigger half, 2-car garage size half of the upstairs, was the development office, which was me and a couple of my friends who were working on some different games, like Chuck Boucher, Chuckles, who did some early Origin work. And the downstairs, the 3-car garage, became our manufacturing and shipping. And Jeff Hillhouse, Jeffrey the Giant, in Ultimas, Jeff was one of our very first employees and still works with us. And he ran the garage, where we had a couple of Apple IIs hand copying discs, and I had a shrink wrap machine, which I still have in my barn, and we hand folded boxes. We the boxes would ship to us flat, and we'd have to sit there in the evening and fold the boxes into a box shape, and hand pack them every night, and shrink wrap them, and put them in crates, and ship them out of the garage. And so we did every aspect of from the creation of the game through literally shipping them out the door. We did all those steps in the garage. Problem was that my brother Robert and his wife Marcy, prior to starting Origin, they had already moved to the Northeast, and they were both managers at AT&T's Bell Laboratories. And Marcy in particular was also a rapid climber in the Bell Laboratories hierarchy, and so she had no interest in coming to Texas. And so Robert, who had just become a private pilot and was flying around in a little Cessna, actually commuted from New Hampshire, or actually from Massachusetts, to Houston for 3 weeks out of the month, and then would fly back to be with his wife for 10 days, 2 weekends, and the week in between. And so for 9 months, he just flew back and forth once a month. And that got pretty old for them. And so it was actually Robert that said, hey guys, will you please have pity on me, and would you guys come to the Northeast for a while, so I don't have to fly back and forth this whole time. And we were young, footloose, fancy-free. We all moved to the frozen wastelands of New England, as I think of it. Stayed there for a couple of years, but then as quickly as possible, I'd already had to come here to school in Austin, and fell in love with Austin. So as soon as I could, I said, hey Robert, I've been here for a few years. I'm taking the Ultima team, and I'm moving to Austin. And once we moved to Austin, slowly the rest of the company came down here too.
But the business offices stayed in New Hampshire for a while.
At least a year, maybe 2.
Yeah.
Because in fact, what moved down first was literally just my Ultima development team. But what we discovered when we moved down here was that there were lots of computer game companies already on the West Coast. Mm-hmm. There were a handful in the Northeast, but there had been no development companies really anywhere in Texas, much less any surrounding states. And so when I opened the Austin Origin office, immediately we discovered this amazing amount of people who were interested in being in this business here in this town. And since we were the only company within 1,000 miles to even consider, people literally just started showing up on our doorstep, including Chris Roberts of Wing Commander fame, and all of the other early folks. I could even argue yourself. Yeah. Because you were here. I mean, it was really location. Austin as a location really was fundamental to the success of Origin, just because there was so much talent here in this town. And so that what started as my Ultima development office quickly, within a year, grew to become the dominant office in the sense of total number of people. The rest of the developers who were up in the Northeast, you kind of always wanted, when you're in the development business, it's kind of fun to be around other developers. So they all moved down south. And then after a while, it was only my brother in the finance department that was left up north. So eventually, they gave in, and Marcy actually decided she liked Austin too, so they moved down here. Both.
So this was in the mid '80s, mid to late '80s.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. I really wish this was working. So then we do come to. Sorry, camera people. Ultima III and perhaps most importantly, Ultima IV. As I said earlier, this really was the game that convinced me. Just as a player, I'm playing Pools of Radiance, and Hills Far, and the other stuff that is happening up at SSI. I'm playing your early competitors, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, comes this. I mean, to be honest, I hadn't played Ultimas 1, 2, or 3, but this game. It was more than killing monsters. It had a point of view. It was about something. How the heck did that happen?
Yeah, this is a very interesting time for me too. If you think about these earlier Ultimas, I describe them as really learning how to program or learning how to assemble a game. But the storylines, the plots, so to speak, the plots in quotes for these games were the same as most every other game, which was something you alluded to earlier. It's your job is to kill the bad guy, because you're told the instructions. The bad guy sits and waits for you in the final level. The bad guy doesn't do anything to be worthy of being considered being the bad guy. And in fact, you, the player, kind of pillage and plunder your way until you become powerful enough to go kill him. And that's what my games were too. Kill the wizard. Kill the evil wizard. And even if you look at the sales curves, as profitable as these were, there were other games like Wizardry, which was out during the same period. And Wizardry, when it came out, it started with 3D graphics, and so it outsold Ultima, 3 or 4 to 1 originally. But there was something interesting that occurred. Those games, after say Wizardry sold really well, they made a sequel using the same game engine. And so the people who wanted to play the sequel tended to be a subset of the people who bought and enjoyed the first game. And so their sequels sold less than their originals. Whereas each Ultima, I was rewriting from scratch, and I was bettering it in every way I possibly knew how, really just as a personal mission. I wasn't thinking about it from a sales standpoint. But the side effect was that each Ultima was doubling or tripling or quadrupling the sales of its predecessor. And so an interesting kind of switchover that was occurring about this point in time. But more importantly was when you mentioned Ultima III was the first game Origin published. Because, and the reason why that's important is that any letter that anybody might have written to California Pacific or the company that eventually became known as Sierra, I never saw. That fan feedback, fan mail or criticism, I never was aware of it in any way, shape, or form until Ultima III. Ultima III was the first time that I got to read everything that anybody wrote to the company. And by the way, if you ever receive or send fan mail, here is the architecture of a mail that you always receive, and they are universally this way. It is one paragraph of how much they bought and enjoyed your game, and then it is pages of here's what you did wrong. And that's when they're good letters. When they're bad letters, they just dive right in with the boy, you're a real stinker, and here's why.
We'll talk about Donald Glinky later.
Yeah. And amongst the mail that we would get, not only was there lots of what I'll now describe as criticism that was paraded as fan mail, but there was also criticism of people who never played the games. I would receive criticism from people who just hated role-playing games, paper or pencil or otherwise. I would usually religious extremists writing me going, you're the quote satanic perverter of America's youth, yes, which is my favorite thing I've been called.
You win.
And I was very proud of that one. And but there was such a level of criticism that came in, and I was still another thing that was happening about this point in time this is right when we moved to New England. And so prior to this, I developed Ultimas 1 and 2 and 3 in my house with my parents, in Texas, in Houston. And finally, when I moved to New Hampshire, not only was I living on my own, but I bought a house, I bought a car, I bought stereo equipment, got robbed. You're doing a variety of things which I'll call maturing. Plus, you're starting to receive, critical fan mail as well as attack mail. And so it's a time of what I'll call great introspection. It was a time where, I sat back and said, wow, to what degree do I agree with any of this? To what degree, how do I internalize this? On the one hand, I'm kind of proud that people called me the satanic perverter of America's youth in a kind of weird way. But on the other hand, that really wasn't what I was intending. In fact, so I would at least sit back and think, why do people think that? Why do they say that? Because I don't think fantasy is evil. But why don't I think that? And how could somebody get that impression? And what can I do in my fantasies to make sure no one can have that impression? Because that wasn't what I was trying to do. And then I thought of, creating a game where the bad guys, instead of sitting around and waiting for you, the bad guys were active and actually doing evil in the game while you were in the game, and you could see it, and therefore they were worthy of you considering them as the adversary. And the NPCs you would run into would correctly articulate that, hey, this is what this bad guy's doing just now while you in front of your face to make them your worthy adversary. And simultaneously, I thought, the player, as opposed to killing all the NPCs, which I was learning everybody was doing, because it was the fastest way to advance was to kill all the good guys. I said, well, I don't want people to be killing the good guys. I want to make, if they do, I'm going to still let them, but I'm going to make them suffer for it. And I'm going to say, if you go and steal from the shopkeepers, well, the next time when you need a clue from the shopkeeper's not going to give you the clue because you're a jerk. And so I began to write all this, behind the scenes code where I would still let everybody play. I wouldn't tell them up front that this game was different. I would still let them be evil, as I now was interpreting it, but I would make the game respond to it in a way that I thought was reasonable and realistic. And when I was working on this, I was actually sincerely worried that this would not work. And I don't mean not work technically, I mean not work as in people just wouldn't like it. Because it was obvious that people were getting their greatest joy out of doing things like killing all the NPCs in town. And here I was going to create a game which was going to force them into a particular code of behavior that I wasn't sure that they would really appreciate. And while these early games all took me what I'll call weeks to months to create, Ultima IV took me 2 years. And at the, that's still a long time, but especially for back in the 80s, that was forever. And so I really fretted over that game, and I was honestly fearful that that game would be a flop. Fortunately, however, it became the first #1 best-selling game that I ever did. So things turned out to, even though I was quite worried about it, it is really what kind of put me on the map, I think.
And the thing that always amazed me, I responded immediately to Ultima IV, and in fact, as strange as it may sound, just preparing for this and thinking back over the years that we worked together and sitting down to create the Black Book for Ultima VI and all of that. I started thinking about that in the context of the game I'm working on right now, which I can't talk about, or Disney's laser satellites will destroy me on the spot. But I actually went back and today sent an email to my design team saying, we're going to make some changes in the game because I forgot some of those lessons. And they're still such an important part of what I do for a living. But it seems like there was a period of, probably 10 years where we were the only people doing that kind of thing. But now it's with the stuff that BioWare is doing, and what Peter Molyneux is doing now, it seems like people are starting to catch on. Do you feel like, or do you feel vindicated by that, or?
Well, so here's my
why do you think it's so long too? That's the other
well, I still clearly believe in it devoutly. I think it by all means is the quote right way to go. However, it's that thought is tempered by a counterpoint. And the counterpoint for me is that the technology of making games still moves forward so fast that when you think about, why have games not become more literary in the history of games? Why is it so few have even approached the concept of trying to be, have deeper meaning, so to speak? Even though it seems so much the right thing to do, even to make it popular, not the right thing to do moralistically. I just mean for the success of the product. I think has to do with, again, how fast technology moves forward. And I've lived through this industry long enough to watch this cycle that I described, where if you look at the quote 3D shooters, well, 3D shooters have existed since before 3D. that game I called Escape that I was talking about was basically run around through a maze till you get out. And then eventually those games were made to where there's another character you could go in and chase around in the maze or shoot in and around the maze. And eventually it became 3D graphics software and eventually 3D hardware, et cetera. So there's a continuity that goes all the way through the whole history. But what you find is that every time there's a major advancement technologically, like first was just the Apple II at 1 megahertz, then the PC at 10 megahertz. Then you go from 640K to where you can get a DOS that goes beyond 640K, so you can suddenly get more memory. And then you suddenly get, instead of just a floppy drive, which will only hold about 10 pictures on it, you get the hard drive, which will hold 100 pictures on it. And then the CD drive, which will hold 1,000 pictures on it. And then finally the internet, which means you have an infinite database to pull from. Each time you get one of those major technology inflections, what I'll call resolution of the simulation, the quality of the graphics goes way up. But the gameplay goes back to basically the simplest first-person shooter again. Because the bells and whistles have become so much cooler, that step has become so big that you don't need any depth because it just looks so much better. However, as soon as that one's out, to compete with that one, you have to add depth. And to compete with that one, you have to add more depth. And to compete with that one, you have to add more depth until the next big technological advancement, in which case everything resets again back to the lowest common denominator of gameplay. And so I think that until computer technology plateaus or tools become so ubiquitous it's trivial to put lots of stuff together, which ain't happening anytime soon. Neither of those are happening anytime soon. I think we're going to constantly be in this struggle between this rubber band between games which are extremely simple and sell only on gameplay with bells and whistles of visuals and graphics and music, etc. And then the pendulum will swing during the 5 years till the next big advancement. Games will become deeper and deeper for a brief window. That's my theory.
Okay. I'm going to jump about 15 years ahead here and get myself in a world of trouble. We'll come back to chronology in a minute.
Okay.
One of the things I look at in the MMO space is those games they're such incredible social experiences, social experiments almost. And yet they look and kind of play like games from 5 years ago, at least to me. And why aren't we seeing more depth when you don't have to worry about AI? When you've got humans interacting with each other, why aren't we seeing more literary things happening? To use your term, by the way. I mean, more depth in the expressiveness we allow real human players in MMOs. It still seems like, it's still about combat. It's still about fighting. It's still about advancement. It's still about game design ideas we rejected 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah. But here's the thing about MMOs. So MMOs have this great new feature called everyone in the world gets to play together at the same time. However, they also have this great new technological problem to solve called everyone in the world gets to play together at the same time. And that problem is so big that the cycle time on MMOs is enormous. And even if you skip how much time I spent on this game and go to the speedy games, which might be 4 years for the speedy ones, that still means that the iteration, we've only been through 2 iterations. In the 10 years of existence of this industry, there is no team who's making MMOs who's done more than 2. And so that's a very slow iteration time. And one of the things you said is, since everybody in the whole world's playing together anymore, you don't need AIs. And I've heard a lot of people who even make MMOs make that same comment, and I just don't agree with that. I actually think AI still plays an enormous role, even in MMOs. Sure. And while of course, there's a great deal of fun associated with the complexity of another human being and the subtlety of interaction with another human being, that if you're trying to do something, quote, literary, which means take all the real people, and take them on an emotional, if not spiritual journey, that requires game design that has now become phenomenally more complicated to do it instead of just telling telling a narrative on paper that someone is going to read, I think is already phenomenally complicated and difficult. Writing a narrative that's now interactive for one player, where the player is going to wander on and off the path that the main character in a storybook might have taken, that is radically more complicated, as you are personally well familiar. Well, having done 2 MMOs now, let me tell you that to try to tell a story when there's tens of thousands of people there all at the same time and try to tell a narrative at the same time, that is yet another level more complicated.
Okay, but again, just to ditch chronology completely.
Yeah.
What made Ultima IV work was not, hey, this has a great story in the traditional sense. What made it work was the principles and the virtues. You know, those 3 principles and the 8 virtues, and how the player interacts with them, and how the player feels about them, and how the player embodies them. And it just seems to me that if you did an MMO, I mean, this is so easy for me to say. Look at me, I've never done one, you know. But well, I mean, I'm starting to get totally psyched about doing one, which is the scary thing. It just seems like if you had the discipline to say, we will not put a gun in this game. We will take away the one tool that every player is going to use because it's always the easiest thing to do, and we're going to create game systems that support or undercut these virtues. Take the 8 virtues. Take the 3 principles. You know, just the stuff that you were doing 15 years ago, and see how a group of people do those. You can create gameplay that doesn't involve shooting, combat, and
but don't forget,
you know,
even Ultima IV did include lots of shooting and lots of combat.
I know.
And so I actually think I think there's 2. I would dissect your proposal into 2 parts. One is, you know, the one dissection I would take was how to add depth to the experience, which I'm completely with you on. However, the take guns out of the simulation, I think that most most of the successes that we've had in creating game design have included the struggle between characters, and that struggle doesn't have to include guns, but it does have to involve some form of competition in a sense.
Sure.
And so once you agree that there needs to be competition, or there ought to be competition, I don't think guns are a bad way, or swords, or other things are a way to.
You know, I'm not at all opposed to having guns in combat in games. By the way, that's just. It just seems like as soon as we put them in, as designers, we immediately fall back on, okay, we'll just we'll make a combat.
I agree.
But
I agree.
I just think there are other forms of competition. There's make yourself the most effective cult leader. There's build yourself the most amazing ziggurat and convince all these other people to work with you using all these other systems. You can create systems that allow competition and interaction in other ways, and I don't see anybody do it.
Well, here's what's interesting about that. You know, you also mentioned that you see that MMOs have.
UO did more of that, by the way, than any other game since, which drives me nuts.
That's what I was about to get to, which was that if you look at UO, UO really was graphically 5 years behind the state of the art, because that's literally what we did to build the game. We went and took an Ultima that was 5 years old, took the graphics literally out of that Ultima, and built this online game called Ultima Online. So I mean, it's precisely 5 years old technology and graphics. If you look at Tabula Rasa, I would argue that Tabula Rasa is very, very close to the cutting edge of even a first-person shooter in the sense of its quality of its graphics, even though it's doing a lot more. It's solving a much more difficult problem, but still you have to compete at that cutting edge, or you don't get visibility with the players. But what's interesting is that as I look at the evolution of the MMO space, Ultima Online at least attempted some of the things you're describing, and did allow a wide variety of avenues of advancement, a wide variety of avenues of participation. But by the way, that requires creating code for a extremely wide variety of features. But each of those features was only simulated to a relatively minimal depth, I'll call it. Because if you have a finite amount of time, you can either add more features or add depth to the features you have, right? And in the case of Ultima Online, we chose to do many, many features relatively shallowly. And we added depth over the years that it ran. But if you look at most other MMOs that have shipped since then, and I'll use EverQuest as the prime model, EverQuest is definitely a combat and advancement game. And almost every other MMO that has been developed since then, all the way up through, I'll use World of Warcraft as a contemporary example, they are all basically EverQuest. Every one of them is basically EverQuest. They've got better graphics, they've got slicker UI, they've got some better sound, but the gameplay model has basically been unchanged, up through until, of course, Tabula Rasa,
all right.
which I will argue not only brings back in a lot of some of the thinking of the early Ultima series, but actually begins to explore what I think are more interesting gameplay angles that I think that the otherwise stagnant MMO genre has missed.
Okay, I'm trying to decide whether to go back to chronology or keep going down this road. So let's stick with this for a minute. We'll come back to chronology if we have time.
Okay.
So what? So what do you think are the advances in Tabula Rasa? I mean, I know you talked a lot about tactical combat stuff over the years. Where are the advances?
Yeah, so I think there's now I'll try not to fall into marketing spiel because this is obviously something I've been talking a lot about recently. But there's really three areas that I personally truly believe Tabula Rasa has tried to break the mold of the traditional MMO and do something that I think is more interesting, more powerful, and hopefully will ultimately give us more success. One is the combat system. If any of you have played any of that pantheon of EverQuest clones, you will probably be familiar with this combat model, which is that you run around through the world and you come up to an opponent who's standing around waiting for you. You click on them, you now have them highlighted, and now you, instead of looking at the 3D world at all, instead of being immersed in the reality of the game, you ignore that, and instead you look at your shortcut bar, where you go sword swing, fireball, healing potion. And you do your little series of commands that does the maximum damage over time until one of you or the opponent is dead, as you play this kind of turn-based whack-a-mole until one of you is dead. And then, by the way, if you just back up 100 yards, that same creature will fade right back in, right where it was, and to wait for the next person to come and farm them for their XP, and you go run back to town to wash, rinse, and repeat. And I personally don't find that to be particularly great gameplay.
I use the word pathetic, actually.
Yeah, so that was the first thing we decided to really shake up in Tabula Rasa. So what we did is we said, look, we want people to be more immersed in what's going on. And while I enjoy role-playing personally over a first-person shooter, because I'm not skilled enough to be really good at a first-person shooter, my dexterity is not good enough. And so I like having a character that has attributes and things I can accumulate to grow over time to make me more powerful through my investments of time. But I want to also be immersed in what's going on in the 3D space. And so the way we did that is we said, look, instead of having the shortcut bar that you're staring at, let's make it to where when I click my left or right mouse button, it either fires my weapon or fires off an ability. And it does so not just at the pixel perfect thing I'm pointing at, but it actually gives me some targeting assistance to where if I've swept past you recently, it knows I mean to shoot at you. And so now I'm going to do role-playing die rolls, me versus you. But then we're going to take the 3D world into account. So for example, if I'm shooting at somebody standing behind the podium, the fact that they are mostly hidden by the podium means the die roll will be modified to make that harder, or I'll do less damage to them when I shoot at them. On the other hand, if I'm standing in full open, they'll do full damage when they shoot at me. If I'm crouched down, therefore, like if you're shooting a gun for real, you would, being prone or something would actually assist you. But on the other hand, if somebody's about to hit you with a club, if you're sitting on the ground, they're probably going to be much more successful than if you're standing up and could easily move out of the way. And so we take those kinds of 3D environment aspects into the calculation. And so what that makes you do is instead of, if you go to Baghdad and you're going to go, work down the streets, you don't walk down the middle of the street like you do in World of Warcraft and whack-a-mole with the guy in front of you. You go hide behind the big wall. And then you work over to the next big wall, and then you work over to the next big wall. And so when you play Tabula Rasa, you are encouraged very strongly to do that behavior. And so it feels more realistic. And it feels more like you're really doing something. You're really involved. If you stand in the open, you take a lot of damage. You stand behind something, you take a lot less damage. And so I believe we've created a combat system that is, while it's still a role-playing game, feels more immersive, feels more immediate, and I think is notably superior to the status quo. Mm-hmm. That's one. Number two is what I call the dynamic battlefield. Going back to, again, in most games, when you kill that monster and you walk back 100 yards, it will just fade right back in so the next person can come hunt them. And so all the creatures in the game really just wait around for you to come farm them, which goes back to the early Ultimas and the games that I was trying to get rid of, where these bad guys aren't doing anything bad. They're just literally waiting for you to come farm them for their XP. And so I said, look, in our game, the bad guys, when they come into the world, they're going to go do something. And they're going to do something that if they succeed will really harm the progress of players. And so the NPCs, when they spawn in, they go and they try to take over outposts. And if they take over an outpost, it means the hospitals are offline, the shops are all offline, the rapid transit waypoint system is offline, the perimeter defenses change color to where you can't enter, all the automatic gunnery that's on these embattlements now fire at you versus support you. And so whole swaths of the game become unavailable or inaccessible to the players until the players get enough people together to go, hey, we need to go retake that little outpost, or none of us who are on this mission arc in that whole area of the game can continue. And so now the game feels more, feels less like I'm just being led by the nose to go complete the next quest, And in fact, the real-time changes in the environment are having a substantial effect on my progress.
It's almost like you're creating a world.
Exactly. That's a living, breathing world.
I swear,
not a static world.
I'm still doing that. I keep telling the team, it's like, we do not make movie sets, we create worlds.
That's right.
I'm still saying that.
And I believe it. And then the third area that I think is most notable is my attempt to bring things like ethical parables into it, which is now my broad categorization of what I think started in Ultima IV. Is that if you look at most MMO storylines, they're traditional go kill evil wizard storylines. Usually go kill 5 orcs and then 10 trolls and then 20 of those and continue. And so the storylines are quite overused and simplistic, I think. And in an MMO setting, it is particularly difficult to put people on a story arc because if you're running alongside other people, you can kind of compare notes and go, you can't change. Like if I've destroyed a town and you've saved the town, well, there's the town. Is it destroyed or is it not? And the reality needs to be the same for both of us. And so it becomes quite complex to do sophisticated storytelling in an MMO setting. And so the way we accomplish it is we use what I'll call the traditional MMO setting where everybody can see each other to do certain kinds of story elements that we can handle through simple flag setting or through simple NPCs reacting to you differently than they might react to me, but the NPC at least exists for both of us. And then when we get to the point where one of us needs to destroy the big factory that's churning out all the evil minions against me, we then transition the game into instance spaces. And in that instance space, we can now give you a customized experience for you and your party who are on the same mission arc to go do a very complex series of quests. It's not a randomly generated dungeon as most MMOs have in their spaces. It's not your chance to get the rare drop from the boss monster, which is how they handle it in most MMOs. It is our chance to do real detailed storytelling and give you a really big payoff for having completed a major story arc. And we get you to see big giant destructions of whole complexes of the bad guys' stuff as your reward for completing one of the major story arcs.
That's excellent. Actually, since we're so far out of the chronology, do you want to throw up some video up here?
Absolutely.
We have some video of Tabula Rasa, and then we can maybe break for some questions from the class. Take a quick break, and then maybe we'll get back to the chronology. Maybe we won't. We'll see.
Okay, well, hang on. Let me just switch the video output here.
And I am caught once again.
And there's two bits I'm going to show you. The first one is a pre-rendered flick, which is the intro flick for Tabula Rasa, which just shows kind of what I'll call the storytelling introduction to the game.
Rated T for teen.
We never saw it coming. We were too busy watching our big screen TVs, reading trash tabloids, and swallowing prescription antidepressants. We never stood a chance. For all I know, it's gone forever. We never saw it coming, but our leaders did. They couldn't save all of us, so they handpicked the ones who could fight. They created wormhole portals using alien technology hidden on our planet centuries ago. Portals to the front lines of a war that had been raging for eons on worlds we never knew existed. Today, we fight. secret, an ancient legacy we don't fully understand. An alien power has awakened in some of us. Over time, it's changing us, evolving us. But change is what we need. A fresh start, a clean slate.
And so now you can see that the setup of the game involves basically the destruction of the Earth, and we few survivors, who all happen to be people who are subscribing to the game, miraculously, are live to fight on another day. And the Tabula Rasa, the game, actually takes place on a variety of alien worlds originally. In fact, we ship with 2 alien worlds, and we're already developing the third. And someday in the future, we actually might give you the smoking husk of the remains of Earth as a battleground as well. But the other little piece of trailer I want to show you here too. This is actually also a marketing piece, but it's built out of actual gameplay footage, so it kind of shows the gameplay in it as well, versus bothering to set up, connect to the network and then play the game for real, so to speak. Let's go here.
That means attacking quickly, ruthlessly.
In a sec, let's start that over.
Rated T for team.
By the way, the fuzzy effect is on
Datelab,
purpose.
Fort Defiance, the planet Thorius. At AFS High Command, General Thaddeus T. Bailey and his deputy commanders decide when and where the army of Allied free sentients will strike next. Today, Valverde Plateau is that battleground.
We'll hold this continent, mark my words. That means attacking quickly, ruthlessly, and violently. We can't afford to rest. We can't afford to retreat. We attack. We always attack.
But light years away, on the planet Ariki, comes somber news. Without warning or provocation, the enemy launched a sudden and devastating surprise attack on Fort Intrepid, the largest AFS installation on the continent of LIGO. Now, the surviving members of the 105th Infantry struggle to hold the tunnels beneath the ruined fort and protect the wormhole portal that is their only link to the outside world. Company Clerk Private Drake.
Guys down here, mostly we're what's left of the 105th. They called us Duncan's Demons after our CO. We're fighting for Earth, sure, but we're also fighting for Commander Duncan. When the fort was attacked, the commander dragged more than a dozen wounded guys off the battlefield before he got taken out by a Bane mortar. Freaking crusties. But yeah, the commander was awesome.
AFS scientists continue to study the mysterious artifacts left behind by the ELO. Their wormholes and control point obelisks have changed warfare forever. But the power of Logos might prove the greatest breakthrough of all. Earlier this week, High Command officially sanctioned the use of the Logos ability Carpet Bombing. This devastating attack will allow a Ranger to teleport AFS ordnance and deliver a massive rain of explosive energy to any location. Powers such as these are our best hope for victory. But for today, human survivors continue to stream through the wormhole portals, joining their brothers and sisters on these strange and hostile worlds. While their stories are different, they have one thing in common: a willingness to fight. The AFS and you, fighting hard, fighting strong, fighting together.
And so that bit of footage there is how we also are introducing players. As you travel from continent to continent, we have been producing these little videos like that one to introduce you to the new space, or in some cases announce new features in the game, which is what was kind of embedded in that little one there too. So anyway, that's a little taste of Tabula Rasa.
Okay. Do you want to bring up the lights and do some Q&A from the class? While I reconnect here. Anybody got any questions?
Yeah.
So you mentioned having a party come together for a particular
Right.
Does that happen for everyone in the space all at the same time? Or, like, it seems like people would miss out on the story sometimes.
Yeah, the way we do that is that when players get together, of course, fundamentally, you are your own avatar running around in the world independently. However, people are allowed to group up in a variety of data forms, you might say. One is a party, and if you party with other players, it means you get to see their details of their statistics on your screen also, and things like when you pick up certain missions or when you collect certain kinds of treasure or get certain kinds of rewards, it's shared amongst that group. So that's a close-knit group that we call a party, and that also goes away as soon as you log out. So if you log out, you're disbanded from the party. So it's a temporary, transient, but close-knit group. We also have clans in the game, or guilds as some people might refer to them, and they are persistent, bigger groups that you can also join forces with other people that give you the ability to be part of a bigger group, and they also can share a variety of things as well. But when you're in a party, that's most important for when you enter these instance spaces. And how we do that is that if all of us are playing the game and all of us were not in a party together at all, and we all we go through the doorway to this place called the Provost Research Facility, which is one of the very first instances you go to where you get to blow up a big building. Each of us that goes in, as soon as we walk in, it gives each one of us a custom, separate copy of that map. And therefore, each one of us can choose to blow it up or not, or succeed or fail at blowing up that building. And that flag will be set on each of us to where if we leave and come back, if I blow up the building's still blown up, if you know what I mean. So it keeps that state persistently. Now, when you party together with another group, if Warren and I were in one party and the rest of us were all independent, everyone else would go in, they'd get their own independent group, they'd get their own independent map. But when I go in, I open up an independent map. When Warren walks in, since he's in my party, he actually joins my instance. When we set up the instance, since we already know who your party members are, at that time when the first person enters and it opens up that map, it scans every party member to determine what I'll call the least common denominator of the group is to set up the map. So that, for example, if Warren had never been to that map but I had, we set it up for Warren because he's never had a chance to blow up the building before, so we're going to set it up to his state. And that's just the way we manage it, to where everybody gets a chance to go do all the content.
But you still have a choice to either blow
it up or not, or succeed or fail. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the story becomes different for.
That's correct. And so everybody, and so if you think about it, here's the way we've kind of rationalized that before we published it, and it seems to have hold true for the players also. If you think about playing Ultima IV Quest of the Avatar, where your job is to become the one pure hero champion of virtue, well, you know darn well that your next door neighbor and everybody else who's bought this game is on the same story path where they're going to be the one true avatar. And of course, it doesn't bother you. It doesn't even bother you enough to, you'll even call up your friend and go, hey, how'd you get past that, to get through it. And the reason why it seems okay that they think they're the one true avatar also is because they're not in your game in front of you running across that threshold being crowned the avatar while you're kind of watching them and thinking, wow, I wish I had that chance. And so that's what we do too. By doing it inside of an instance, that's enough segregation to where it seems okay that when I leave the instance and go back to the main game world where everybody else can sit around and talk about, like, well, hey, what did you do in Provis? Well, I defeated it. Oh, I failed it. Well, shucks, how did you beat it? And they talk about how they beat it, and then the other guy will go, okay, well, now that I know that, I'm going to go back in there and try to beat it this time. And people don't seem to mind that they've had a different experience in a private space. Similarly to if I own a copy of a solo player game and you own the copy of a solo player game, we don't seem to mind because you're, again, not rubbing it in each other's face at the time that it's occurring. Yeah?
To just kind of take your words, people don't seem to mind if they have a different experience in a specific space. Like, do you think instancing is really so much worth the effort to give people these dedicated story spaces when they're not operating in any sense under that illusion?
Here's why I think it is that, again, I'll go back to what I was saying there, which is that I think it would be disappointing if 10,000 of us were playing Quest of the Avatar to become the one true avatar, and I watched, me and Warren were both walking toward the spot on the ground where you stand and you get crowned as the one true avatar, and I watched him get crowned the one true avatar, and then I go, oh, I'm kind of second to the party. I still get crowned, but I'm obviously second because there's this queue of people lined up to go through to get crowned. I think it makes you feel a lot less special. And I think that part of the fun of reading an adventure novel or playing an adventure game is the belief that you are special. And even though I think everybody fundamentally understands the whole point is so we can all have that experience, so you don't mind that other people are choosing to have that same experience. But I think it is a problem if you just put people in a queue and you're kind of waiting for your turn to be crowned. I think it feels a lot less important to you. Plus, if we want to have the event where we do something really grand and glorious, like blow up an entire complex, it's impossible to do in the shared space, because then if you have 10,000 people literally streaming through to blow it up, well, the first person gets there and blows it up, well, that means nobody else either can see it, or you have to wait for it to rebuild itself somehow in front of everybody to then recycle it for each time each person wants to do it, which becomes problematic, you might say. Yeah.
Will you ever consider doing another single player?
Absolutely. I've actually I used to get asked that when I first started doing MMOs. I got asked that a lot. I haven't asked that in a while. But so I by no means think that our work is done. Warren's work is done on solo player games. I think we're still, frankly, in the infancy of this industry at pretty much every level. And I personally, from a creative challenge standpoint, would still just as much enjoy solo player games as MMOs. However, the business opportunity right now, I sincerely believe, heavily favors MMOs. And so therefore, that's why I'm in the MMO business. That being said, MMOs are already becoming phenomenally more competitive, and and the definition of competitive means they're less windfall profit-like. And so therefore, I can easily see a day in the future where I go make solo player games again.
Let me ask a possibly related question from my podium of power. Didn't NCSoft just announce recently that you guys were going to be doing PS3 games?
We did announce that, although those are going to be MMOs.
Oh, okay, those
are MMOs.
Question. Okay.
Yeah, so we, I'm a big PC fan myself, in that I enjoy having the keyboard and sitting in a chair near the screen where you can, versus on the couch with a little controller. I think that kind of the depth of gameplay you get out of a computer is superior, so I tend to personally play that way. However, the majority of games are now bought and sold on consoles, and so and fortunately the hardware is now online capable. But then there's one more factor, which was actually turned out to be the hardest. The reason why I haven't seen very many MMOs on consoles really is business model related. It really comes from, if you look at, let's say you're Microsoft, and you've got the Xbox, and the Xbox has a hard drive on it, and an MMO, every MMO maker changes the data, changes the code in an MMO constantly. It's one of the great advantages of an MMO is that you can constantly stream content and bug fixes and new features and get player feedback and try to stay ahead of them with game masters and with new code all the time, new features, new happenings. Well, if you're Microsoft and you're considering giving a third-party person access to that hard drive, which means they could corrupt the hard drive and therefore destroy the Xbox, that's a big deal to Microsoft and Sony. They are understandably withholding of access to that hard drive, which of course is the antithesis of what we need for MMOs. Plus, we think of our MMO customers as our customers. They think of their online gamers as their customers. And that's another very big important difference when it comes to who owns that relationship and therefore who can upsell them other things, whether it's microtransactions or the next game or whatever else it might be. And so the business model has actually been the biggest stumbling block that I think, and that's why we're specifically with Sony, is really because they're the company that eventually said, okay, we can between the two of us, we can kind of see the way to make a business that seems fair and appropriate and safe to the hardware. Mm-hmm.
I don't really know the timeline for MMOs, but I do know that Ultima Online was one of the forerunners, if not first and possibly most influential.
Mm-hmm.
But what brought about the idea to do with Ultima Online?
Yeah, so what's interesting is, so Ultima is often credited as kind of the beginning of the massively multiplayer genre. And I think in many ways that's true. However, it's also important to point out that as long as there have been computers, people have been networking them together and making things you might describe as online games. And especially places like Kesmai and AOL were doing graphical adventures or text-based MUDs for decades. The thing that was special about Ultima Online is it was the first what I'll call big budget, game, frontline game at a relatively speaking state-of-the-art, production value and scale and marketing, and so therefore kind of broke open the industry. I mean, the most successful online game prior to Ultima Online had a total of about 5,000 to 15,000 subscribers, and then Ultima Online became the fastest-selling PC game in Origin and EA history. Ultima Online has outsold all of the other Ultimas combined times about 10. And so it has just been phenomenally successful, and still has hundreds of thousands of people playing it to this day. Did I answer your question?
So, how long did you think about that before you actually got up the courage to try and pitch that to Origin and EA?
Yeah, that's actually what the detail of your question was. How did we get started? What was the idea, or what kind of got it kicked off? As long as we've been doing Ultimas, I mean, really from the very beginning, Ultima was really D&D. And D&D is a multiplayer social experience, and so I've always wanted Ultimas to be multiplayer, and that's why I even came up with the party members that you would travel with in a lot of the interim Ultimas, is because I felt that party interaction I was simulating playing with a group of your friends to the best of my ability, and so the motivation to do multiplayer had existed long before we started UO, and before starting UO, we'd even had talks with places like AOL to see if they wanted to do some license agreement to do an Ultima, online kind of thing on AOL. That never really came to fruition. Then finally, it was me and a guy named Star Long, who was the producer or director on Ultima Online, also kind of my production partner, who finally said, "Look, we saw that the internet was beginning to exist, and we said, look, we knew this was going to be an inflection point where we're going." This is going to facilitate this kind of game being more accessible than a dial-up service you had to pay for on things like AOL. And so we went and pitched the game to EA and said, hey, with this really crazy idea, we want to do this thing called an online game. The way EA worked, and still works, is I think kind of interesting that they do everything based on sales projections. So if you have a game idea, a game pitch, you can go pitch the idea to mostly the sales department. The sales department will listen to your pitch, and they'll go, well, based upon some study of the market, here's what I think this game will sell. And if that sales is high enough, that justifies an investment in development of a similar amount based on the expected sales. Well, the problem is that if you're pitching an online game, and the most successful online game in history has had 5,000 to 15,000 subscribers, that does not justify any development budget. And so, and then they in fact said, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt. We think you'll sell twice as much as the biggest game in history, so we'll give you 30,000 sales, which still gives you zero budget. And so, so they basically said no. So we came back 6 months or a year later, or whatever the pitch cycle was, and we pitched it again, and they said no. And we pitched it a third time, and they said no. But on the third time, I finally went over to Larry Probst, and I said, Larry, for $250,000, which is nothing compared to what we're doing with these games, other games we're doing, we can build a prototype of this game, and we can prove to you that this is worthwhile. And so on a sheet of notebook paper, Larry Probst signed, okay, I give Richard the authority to go $250,000 over budget to go to this dumb thing he wants to do called Ultima Online. And with that $250,000, we went and we scavenged the tile graphics out of Ultima VI, I believe it was, a bunch of the code from Ultima VI. We got, since Origin was hiring people, any other project that, if we had a new programmer that came in and Wing Commander could use them, they went to Wing Commander. It was only the people that no other project in the company wanted that were allowed to be hired by Ultima Online. So we had the scruffiest bunch of misfits in the worst, and we were rebuilding offices, and this team was so much the bastard stepchild team that we were put, no joke, we were in the hallway while the offices were being rebuilt and there was just plastic sheeting hanging down to mask off the offices. We had our desks in the hallway between sheets of plastic as the offices that the game was being built in, while everybody else was already in the finished out parts of the building, because again, this was literally, no one in EA cared about this game because no one believed it would work.
And they cared a lot about Ultima IX too, as I recall. I mean, wasn't that where the bulk of your team was at that point?
Most of the team was on Ultima IX, at the time. Until this interesting moment occurred. Uh-oh. And that interesting moment was that we'd spent basically our whole $250,000. We had our prototype. The prototype, to test the prototype, we now needed thousands of people to run it. But to get thousands of people to play it, we needed to manufacture thousands of discs and send them to thousands of people. But that, of course, cost a lot of money too, and we didn't have that money. And so we went and put up what I believe was really the first website that Origin or EA really had of any significance. And it was basically a website that said, hey, we're developing this game called Ultima Online. We'd love for you to come test it for us, but we need you to send us $5 for the privilege so we can afford to make this CD and send it to you.
And we all thought Richard was nuts.
And 50,000 people within a week or two found that website and signed up to be beta testers.
And then we all said, gee, wish I'd thought of that.
And then it was, yes, suddenly the entire, I'm getting goosebumps telling you about it. And it was suddenly the world changed that day, where suddenly this thing that everybody thought had a maximum possibility of 30,000 units, suddenly everybody realized that this could and probably would be a gigantic hit. And suddenly the coffers of spending were opened wide. And the number of EA managers that came and decided to live in Austin to monitor what we were doing went way up, which is not good. And so suddenly the Bastard Stepchild project became the most important thing happening within EA world, and was often described as that. And then when it did finally ship premature and buggy, it still, in spite of its warts, became the fastest-selling PC game in Origin EA history.
Okay, if they're not going to raise their hands. So what did you think Ultima Online's biggest successes were? How much of your original vision ended up on the screen? Actually, that's true for Tabula Rasa, too. You had a huge reset at one point on Tabula Rasa, I remember. So in both of those cases, Ultima Online and Tabula Rasa, how much of the vision ended up on the screen?
So in Ultima Online,
and what were the successes?
In Ultima Online, we were, much like the early Ultimas, they were a hodgepodge of ideas we thought might work. And if you look at the game when it launched, I actually think most of the things we thought ought to be there were at least present in the game, just some of them were buggier than others, if you know what I mean, or some of the simulations were shallow compared to others. Like, for example, the simulation of fishing was, use a fishing pole, 50-50 chance you get a fish, end of simulation. Yet on the other hand, we did simulations like we had, to keep an interesting, realistic set of missions being offered, we developed this extremely sophisticated virtual ecology. And what I mean by that is that grass in the original launch of Ultima Online really generated blades of grass, which was a consumable by vegetarian creatures like deer and such, which would come around and eat them. And if they ran out of grass, and more deer would spawn until you reach this kind of steady state between grass production and the deer in an area. And then we created wolves, and the wolves that were kind of lived up in the hills, they would forage out to find deer to eat. And as soon as they were satiated, they would go back into their little cave, their hills and the caves in the hills. But if players came along and killed off all the deer, then the wolves, since not finding any sheep the wolves not finding sheep or deer to eat, would forage farther till they came into town and would actually eat village members, which would then spawn quests to say, help, help, the wolves are attacking, which then players could solve by either killing off all the wolves or by repopulating the deer. And we thought this, what a brilliant idea this is. We have this great simulation of this that'll be self-balancing, and boy, isn't this going to be wonderful. And I'm sure none of you have ever heard of it. And the reason why is because it failed dismally. And what happened in practical reality is there were so many people in the game, so many more people in the game than we ever anticipated running around. They killed everything off. And so we couldn't spawn things in the game fast enough to keep any amount of deer or wolves to have the simulation run at all. And so eventually that was just completely removed from the game. On the other hand, fishing became immensely popular, in spite of the fact that it was literally a 50-50 chance you get a fish. And so after that we said, well, I guess since people are enjoying fishing, we'll add sophistication into it. And so we began to add some sophistication into that, although not much. And it still remained popular. And so Ultima Online really was what I'll call the hodgepodge. So and I would say 50% of the things we put in succeeded well beyond our wildest expectations, and 50% of the stuff we put in no one ever noticed and was ultimately ripped out of the game. But it was very much a learning time, you might say.
Was it Zach Simpson, who was one of the programmers, a super genius guy here in town? Was he the guy who sort of masterminded the game economy? A lot of thought went into the game economy.
It might have been Zach. Zach, he started working at he was a big contributor starting with Ultima VII, actually. Yeah. And I suspect it was him that did a lot of the work on the virtual economy, which is another one of those that I would say had a rough beginning, and I would say we were more off-target than on-target originally. but eventually got tuned up to have a good inflow and outflow of currency.
What were the biggest things that surprised you on Ultima Online? I remember the first time I heard about an in-game protest, I just about died because I never anticipated that at all.
There's no question that what we now broadly describe as emergent behavior was the most surprising result. And you've mentioned one, which I'll talk about a little bit, which is the in-game protests. So that when players came in to play the game, they so imagine doing this. So here's the problem of making a massively multiplayer game, or one angle to look at it. Imagine, say, you wanted to build the city of Austin, but imagine just us, just we few. In fact, at the time it was probably we few. We're talking 10 people or so. But let's even take the whole classroom here. Let's suppose all of us decided to build the city of Austin. It's barren plain, and we're going to take a couple of years, and we're going to build the entire city. And I mean everything in the city. We're going to build every road. We're going to put every pipe. We're going to put every object on every store shelf. We're going to set every price. We're going to set every tax rate. We're going to, everything there is to define about this city, every street, every house, every pothole, we will have built it. Then at the end, you're going to say, hey, everybody, we built the city. Come on in. Let's come on in here and live here. And let's say 1 million people all move in a month or two. What's the probability that we built the city even remotely how the people who have now moved in would like it to be? And the answer is close to zero. There's definitely going to be places where the power doesn't work. There's definitely going to be potholes. There's definitely going to be costs that people don't agree with. There's definitely going to be things that economic issues that spin out of control. And so that's pretty much guaranteed. And then all those people, by the way, they're going to be unhappy probably. So they're going to want to say something to somebody. But who are they going to talk to? Well, they probably don't know where most people live, but they probably at least know the email of one guy. And or can figure it out, and or at least the company in general. And so now we're going to have 1 million people who are all going to be screaming about what they think is wrong with the world. And we are probably going to see this stream of mail, and most people are going to be talking about the same things. There's potholes in the east. There's power out in the west. The taxation rate is too high over here, and so we'll go respond to that. But we have no way to tell you. So we can't even communicate back to people that we hear them because there's 1 million people talking. And so you can't send 1 million emails to respond individually to each individual's concerns. And so suddenly you have this problem that the real world has solved with time. In the real world, cities grow over a much longer span of time. And there is a structure, a governmental structure that starts with the mayor and the city council, but then goes to neighborhood watch groups and city and school councils and things, to where there's this up and downward flow of information that makes people believe they have some kind of control at some level within the world in which they live. And those things are just as important in the virtual world as well. And so when what's interesting to circle back now to the in-game protests, when people were screaming about the things they thought were wrong about the game and weren't sure that we were listening to them, although frankly we were, they were still enjoyed the game enough. They didn't want to turn it off and leave the game because they got the power. They got what this brave new world was being uncovered here, but they wanted to make sure that they had gotten our attention as to the things that they really thought were important. And so the way they did it is by deciding to have an in-game protest where everyone in the game would at the same time come into Lord British's castle, take off all their clothes, get their character drunk, which would mean their character start vomiting on the floor, and start screaming obscenities, which of course brought the game totally to its knees, because you bring that many people onto one space and the servers can't keep up with it, so the whole game is just grinding to a halt. There's all these people naked, throwing up and screaming obscenities in the game, to describe what it is they don't like. And so we're, of course, watching this whole thing. In fact, they couldn't have gotten in the castle unless we opened the doors for them because, we had to unlock and open the doors. So we actually facilitated their protest. But we actually thought it was a great measure of success to see that people were so committed to the game that they would do these kinds of actions in the game versus, cancel their subscription. But there were all kinds of other emergent behaviors, including things around fishing. I remember one time I was game mastering invisibly in the game, and I was watching this guy in short pants and a straw hat here fishing, 50-50 chance of fish, 50-50 chance no fish, 50-50 chance of fish, and just standing around fishing. And this guy who came running by was decked out in plate armor, and came trundling on by, and in character he said, "Ah, poor fisherman, I see you are without sword and shield. I am a great warrior. I've just returned from the dungeons, and I've come back with great bounty." He said, "Here, I'm very generous. I'm going to share with you the spoils of war." And he started laying out on the ground, because there was no trading between players at the time, just started laying out on the ground, armor and swords and weapons and all those valuable commodities that he had in excess. And the fisherman chimed back and said, "Look, hey, stop. He said, "Look, you warmonger." He said, "You don't get it." He said, "I am a fisherman. In the morning, I come out here and I fish. In the afternoon, I take the fish into the market and I sell it. And with those proceeds, I go to the pub and I drink with my friends. And that is the way that I like to play. So begone, you warmonger. I have no interest in your spoils." And I sat there watching that. I was just floored, because it's going like, wow, this game has gone so far beyond whatever we had anticipated it to become.
Wow. So on that note, why don't we take a little break? Get back together in about 10 minutes. Maybe get back to the chronology. We'll see. I don't know. We may have blown it. Okay, so let me ask: Are there more questions from the class? Because I really don't want to co-opt the entire time, though I happily can and will. All right, we'll keep going with the class for a while. Go for it.
You mentioned that you tried to aim Tabula Rasa towards the fairly high end, in terms of graphics and such. And I can sort of tell, because my laptop is barely 2 years old and I can't run this thing. But you also mentioned that what am I trying to get at? That's part of the reason why I think MMOs can gather such a large audience, is the other fact you mentioned that the graphics sort of 5-6 years out of date. And so what I'm trying to wonder is that, in sort of trying to aim towards this high-end systems, are you perhaps sort of locking out potential audience, or perhaps the gamers who are maybe less interested in the fancy graphics, and sort of aiming market towards the people who have high-end rigs just to play this sort of.
Can I rephrase the question just a little bit?
Okay.
Do you still believe the old thing we used to talk about at Origin,
Yep.
which nobody remembers the best game that runs on a 386? Everybody remembers the best game.
Yeah. So the way I would phrase that is that no one will remember. A reviewer will never write a review that says that's the very best game I've ever played that still runs on a 286. They'll either write that's the best game I've ever seen, or they won't write anything at all. And the consumers do something very similar. And while Ultima Online was 6 years old by virtue of the fact that we pulled graphics that were literally 5 or 6 years old, compared to the text MUDs, that was a radical improvement. And then EverQuest came out shortly thereafter, which was right back to, relatively speaking, state-of-the-art 3D. And now if you look at WoW or Tabula Rasa and the other MMOs, they're all right up at the state-of-the-art. And so I don't think, while there is a debate in our marketing department regularly where they're going, of course, what I'll really say is the sales department. The sales department always wants you to make sure your game runs and still looks great on as old of hardware as possible, because that gives you the maximum ability to sell to the most people as possible. On the other hand, I still absolutely believe in the adage that active, not only will no reviewer say good things about your game unless it is truly state of the art across the board now, but also, generally speaking, active software buyers are also active hardware buyers. And while it might be great to go, hey, look, if you could just sell a game that will run on hardware that's 5 years old, think how much bigger your market will be. But most people who are running on 5-year-old hardware are not buying new games. That as a general rule, and I believe that's still true to this day, that people who are buying a game a month are buying a new part of their hardware at least once a year. And so we think that while we try to make sure our games will at least function, and by the way, I reuse laptops all the time too, so I'm very familiar with the pain of laptops on Tabula Rasa. And so, by the way, I buy absolutely state-of-the-art laptops, and I can barely get by with it. So I feel your pain. But no, I think that unfortunately that's just kind of part of the requirement for our industry at this point. Back in the back.
All that being said, what is the minimum system spec on Tabula?
Well, I'll have to look. Actually, to be honest, I don't know without looking. But I know it. Broadly speaking, it requires a. Is it on top here?
Yeah, there you go.
Yes, there it is. Minimum specs.
3-point type, so no one can read.
Yeah, exactly. 2.5 gigahertz machine, Pentium 4 equivalent, 512 megs of RAM, although you really want a gig, and DVD. And then an ATI Radeon 9600 or an NVIDIA GeForce 5700 or better, with 128 megs of video RAM. And that's to run it on the low settings. So basically, anything older than 3 years, and you literally cannot play. But to turn on all the bells and whistles, you need something that's less than a year old. Mm-hmm.
How do you find the audience for the games? Because I think, I don't know, as compared to like Final Fantasy and those types of games that appeal to huge numbers of people, like how do you find your niche?
Well, growing an audience, so you can either do something that's the same as others, or you can do something that's new and different. And either path is fraught with a unique kind of peril. And by the way, I devoutly believe in doing things unique and different, because I believe doing things the same as others is almost a guarantee of mediocrity. Final Fantasy is great because Final Fantasy is great, but there are millions of Final Fantasy knockoffs no one's ever heard of, and fall in the gutter. And every now and then somebody else does something new and cool. Like if you look at the whole history of Origin, for those of you who are old enough to remember, in the 20 years or so that Origin existed, we had the Ultima series, we had the Wing Commander series, and we had the Crusader series. 3 series of games that were successful enough to be sequeled regularly. We did lots of other games, but none of them were successful enough to be sequeled. And it's only on a rare occasion that you actually succeed well enough to do something that becomes a powerful intellectual property of its own. And another, I know you didn't ask this question, but another unfortunate side effect is that it also appears in our industry that there are, if you look at people who are successful, there's people like I'm going to use Warren as an interesting case study.
Can I leave the room first?
Warren is actually one of the few people in this industry who worked up through the system, having come from another industry, moved into this industry, came in as what I'll call a supporting character. I actually often will define, I think my best Ultimas were the ones that we collaborated on, in the sense of Warren's storytelling abilities were so far advanced compared to mine that I think it was a great partnership between the two of us. But then when Warren went off to go operate independently, having not grown up in computer games like I did, he had a more difficult path to then rise up to the total success that he's now had since then, because he had to master some of the things that I had done as a child, so to speak. But that's really rare. Warren is a true exception to there appears in our industry to be people who can create hits and everybody else. It really is that there are, and I suspect the same thing's true in the movie industry and books for that matter. Sure. That if you guys are going to get into this industry, you either better have immense confidence that you are one of those people who will create hits individually, or you better seek out and find and work with those people who will make hits. Because otherwise, if you just put a random collection of smart people together and try to go do something, you're going to be spinning your wheels and losing money. This has gone from free money to a very serious, very difficult, very cutthroat, mostly losing industry. And the only way to make money in this industry is to be one of the top 10 products of the year, and otherwise you're noise, and we'll probably lose money. So it's a very different game these days. Hmm?
While you're on Ultima Online shards, what's your opinion on those, pirates or creative people?
Both. So piracy. There's an interesting thing about piracy. So if you go back to this game, it was only the fact that it got pirated that found me my first publisher, because it found its way to California over a few weeks. But in the pre-online game era, our estimation was that for every legitimate copy we sold, there was at least one, or somewhere probably more like 5, illegal versions sold or copied, stolen from the original. And no matter how much effort you put into things like copy protection, that didn't, that slowed it down slightly, but really, over the long haul didn't really slow things down much. The piracy stayed about the same in the industry wide. The interesting thing about online games is that piracy in many ways helped us, because if you go pirate the client, you still can't connect unless you're a paying subscriber to the service. And so as a general rule, piracy went to zero for all practical purposes. Until you see people completely reverse engineer the server and build an entire duplicate of the service that people can connect to, which is obviously a much more difficult problem, to actually write your own server that effectively operates like the main part of the game. And so in one way I go, kudos to you guys, whoever manages to pull it off, because that's a phenomenally difficult task. And I think from the player base, having some interesting alternative way to go play is clearly interesting. The problem, however, is that occasionally people will choose to charge money for it, and that, of course, is phenomenally illegal and easy to track down and squash. And so that's one of the few successful piracy fightings we've done, is when people actually charge money for what we call gray shards. Those are the people we just call up the FBI and call their hotline number, and they're immediately thrown in jail, because it's pretty easy and rampant, and you have a single individual or somebody, whoever the operator is, to target, versus pirates who are all doing it individually spread out around the globe. Yeah.
Has there ever been a really important lesson that you've learned from another MMO, where you've looked at another MMO game and been like, wow, that's something really interesting that I didn't think of?
Yeah. So there's no question that when I play games, there's kind of two reasons I play games. One is to see why they were successful, in which case I often play them just for a few hours, and then I'm kind of done studying it, kind of see what their major advancement was. And then there's games I play because I just think they're really great games, and I play them to conclusion. And those have been, my whole history of games that I've played to conclusion that I didn't write were Myst, Medal of Honor, American McGee's Alice. I could probably name 2 or 3 more, but really only about 5 or 6 games that really were so good that, to me, were good enough to compel me to play them start to finish. But I regularly see things that I look at and go, man, those guys just do that better than I ever do. And one group is the Blizzard guys. The Blizzard guys do polish way better than I have ever done it. And they're willing to sit on something for years and years and years until they've balanced it and tweaked it and balanced and tweaked it and balanced and tweaked it until it's refined to the point where they're personally happy with it. And it's a level of internal discipline that I've never seen any other developer or publisher have. So I'm a big admirer of the Blizzard folks for that reason. But from a feature standpoint, I can't, just like I've, if you look at my whole reading history, it's truly not much more than the Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia and maybe 5 or 6 other books, and that's Hubert's Hair-Raising Adventure, which I've memorized. But
don't ask him.
That'll take me 20 minutes, so we'll skip that. But just like I can say with some honesty that I haven't plagiarized many of my ideas from books, because I really, frankly, haven't read that many books. Same thing is true with games. I've been involved in it since the earliest days, and so it's fairly uncommon for me to see features that other people are doing that I go, wow, that's something I wouldn't have thought of. But there's what I'll call process activities that a lot of other developers do that I do look at and admire and wish that I would do a better job of.
Well, let me ask you a related question. We've had people come in here and say the secret to success is innovation or death. We've had people come in here and say, don't be first into a market. This is the Blizzard guys. Polish what other people have done. We've had a bunch of other answers. Right. What's the secret to success?
Well, so by the way, I think both of those answers are correct. But I'll tell you what my choice is. My choice is the latter, in the sense of I find the path the Blizzard guys have taken, though I admire it, I wouldn't enjoy doing it. And so, therefore, that's not the path for me.
That's why we get along.
And I can see why it works, and I can wish that I could both be what I believe I am as innovative, and take the time to do all that extra polish, which, by the way, will never happen, just because of when you already spend enormous amounts of years struggling. When you decide to go off the path of where everybody else has been and do new things, it's completely fraught with peril. And why I describe that, and as we've often discussed back in the old days, if you're trying to define something that will be fun on paper, the probability is it's not going to be fun. I mean, you can speculate that it'll be fun. You can, like we can speculate that if we do this combat system that includes the 3D environment, you can speculate that on paper that that's going to be fun. But until you actually code it up and start running around in it, you have no idea if it's going to be fun. And the majority of the ideas that you think that sound like they're going to be new and fresh and fun, you put on paper and then you go spend months coding them, the vast majority of them are not fun, and you have to abandon it and start over again. And so going the innovative route is, in my mind, a lot harder. However, if you succeed at creating something that's fun and innovative, I think it guarantees success, and I frankly find it's a more pleasant journey to go on. And so it's my journey of choice. If you're going to go what I'll call the Blizzard route, to me, to some degree, it's a mystery, because there's tons of Me Too products that come out that are in fact better. There's tons of what I'll call Diablo clones that are in fact better than Diablo, but most of you have never heard of them just because they weren't enough better to get people to notice. And so I think that journey is probably even more difficult and definitely not my choice. Alan?
An Origin employee from the 90s told me that you had evolved a personal life philosophy that you called secular hedonism.
I call it ethical hedonism.
Ethical hedonism.
Ethical hedonism.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, and that to a large degree still is my philosophy of life, I must say. And I've actually debated on putting it in as into the games, even as a fundamental follow-on to if you think about the virtues in the Ultima system, those, while I really admire it, I mean I think it worked out quite well. It's also clearly fiction, but it's good fiction. I mean it's positive and well-meant fiction. And so I actually sat down after that and I said, look, if I'm ever going to sequel the virtues of Ultima, I can't do it with another arbitrary piece of fiction, because all it will then be is different, if you know what I mean. And it'll be compared to the virtues of Ultima, and that one worked out really darn well. So I find it very hard to compete with what I've already done. And so I said, look, if I'm going to compete with something I've already done, it has to be less fictional and more what I really believe is right. And so this is kind of taking us over to another kind of category of subject about my philosophies on game design, which I'll talk about here briefly, which is I'm a devout believer in research for game design. I think any idea that anybody has that is their off-the-cuff answer to, I've played a bunch of games in this industry, and I think the best idea would be to change it in this way, and this now it'll be way cooler if I just do this, what I thought of last Sunday. I think it is the probability of it actually being compellingly fresh and new is about 0. And the only way to come up with something that is actually compellingly fresh and new is to work at it very hard, including a bunch of actual research on the actual subject that you're trying to innovate on. And so, for example, whether you're doing virtual languages or virtue systems or combat, whatever subject you're going to tackle, you had better become an expert on that specific subject, really, if you want to do something that is truly advancing the state of the art. And so when I said, look, I want to pursue a virtue system that I might put into a game in the future that it would be superior or a worthy follow-on, I said, look, I need to become an expert in philosophy. And so you'll see, in fact, Warren knows even back at Origin days, I used to have a research library, and it's continued to grow. It doesn't fit my office anymore. It's now in the hall because it's multiple bookshelves wide. And it is pretty much a shelf or two devoted to each of the subjects that I've chosen to tackle as my personal contribution to the game design of the game we're working on. And so a couple shelves is devoted to philosophy. And so I spend a lot of time pouring through that, thinking about what kind of statement could I put into a game that wouldn't offend people who had, when you talk about people's belief systems, you're treading on very dangerous waters of finding things that people can buy into and support and not be offended by, and especially if you're trying to describe something you think is more truth than fiction. And so ethical hedonism was to circle back now, in its basis pretty simple. It basically said, fundamentally the purpose of life is to be happy, and if you're not at least trying to be happy, you will succeed at not being happy, and that's just too bad for you. And in your pursuit of happiness, you should be free to do pretty much anything you want, as long as you are not interfering with other people's pursuits of their happiness, which I will describe broadly as ethics. And so I've said, look, as long as people are treating each other ethically, but otherwise, try to be happy. I've got a much more sophisticated breakdown beyond that, the pale of the name, but at least as a basis to then build a virtue system out of, I felt that that was correct and defendable foundation to build from.
And is that in Tabula Rasa?
That is not in Tabula Rasa, and the reason it's not. And by the way, it's a good case study when I was describing how you'll put 1,000 things in the game and half of them will work and half of them won't. That I originally intended to put that or something like it into Tabula Rasa. We intended originally to have a virtue system like in the Ultima series before it, but as we began to implement it, I wasn't convinced that we had a game mechanic link to that virtue system that was unique and compelling compared to what I'd already done before. And so I backed away from inserting it because I didn't want to retread over the same ground until I felt I could do it in a compellingly unique way. Yeah?
So what changes do you see in how a company runs from, say, a 3-person company to a 30-person company to a 300-person company?
Yeah, what's interesting is the most difficult growth stage was going from doing the games by yourself to doing them with a team of any size. And a size I'll describe as more than 3, because 3 is still pretty much your show. Or at least you feel like you can control the parts of it that you think are important for you to control. And the other people who are working with you, you can imagine are a clearly supporting cast to do the things that you either don't want to do or frankly can't do. And they are supporting what is clearly still your vision. Once you build a team past 5 or 10 people, and especially once you're doing MMOs, the task has now become so complex that no one, including yourself, is an expert on the whole system. And through that journey, you also get to a point where you will hand off a combat system to somebody to go do, and their vision for it or their implementation of it will be different than the way you would have done it. Not only different in the mechanics of its internal operations, but I mean different in how it expresses to the player to be played. And the fact that it's different immediately gives you doubt in its quality, especially if you've grown up doing them all on your own, and so you have a great deal of faith invested in your own work. And so that process of learning that different does not mean worse. Different means it actually could easily be better. And you really need to, you've got to let go and let other people, not only have influence, but often the dominant influence over broad sections of what you believe is your company or your vision or your product, is a very painful transition to go through.
Can I also say you'll deal with that every single day, including today?
And but that's probably the biggest growth hurdle to get over. And but once at least my answer. So here's how I got over it. And it's a kind of a cheating way to get over it, which is that So again, if you look at Ultimas 1 through 4, I did it all by myself. A couple people supporting me, still was fine. It was clearly my game. Ultimas 5, 6, and 7, when we were working together, those were tougher because the results were clearly better, but it was. But I could at least imagine myself doing what Warren would be doing, if you know what I mean. And I'm not using. We actually don't think we actually had any struggle, but I can. Some of the programmers and other people that generally would actually have this issue with. But you could at least imagine that it might be true between the two of us. If I felt that I could do the job he was doing, but he was doing it differently or maybe better, that would be a difficult time. Until what happened is when we went from when we switched from working on the Apple to the PC. I was a programmer as long as we were on the Apple. As soon as we switched to the PC, I was out of date as a programmer. So I quit programming, and suddenly I didn't care what the programmers did because it was no longer anything I could contribute to. So basically the way I cheated was to get myself out of the competition, if you know what I mean. So I took myself completely outside of the purview of the area that other people were working. And even now on Tabula Rasa, if you look at Tabula Rasa, my contribution it's interesting to see that my contribution on Tabula Rasa is things like the language, it's things like the history, it's things like the parts that I believe give it the depth and sophistication that I believe are what made my work in the past special. that frankly nobody else on the team gets or cares about. I mean, if I gave the language or something, anything to anybody else, they wouldn't get it, and they wouldn't do it with nearly the same level of passion or devotion to making it, quote, right, like I would do. And so therefore it's something I really can't pass off to somebody else.
Have you moved far enough? I'll say this because I have, okay? I've moved far enough from the nuts and bolts of the games that I work on now that I can't even call myself the project director. That I provide creative direction. I mean,
Right.
it's a subtle difference, but it's an important
No,
one.
yeah. So even though I'm called the executive producer on this game, Star Long is the producer and the director of the game. Absolutely, there's no question that I am this kind of, creative consultant who throws a lot of weight around, kind of sitting beside Star to tell him, well, you might think you guys are going that way, but I'm telling you, you're not. You're now going this way a little more. And so, yeah, I have this very unusual position. The practical reality of my position is that I am not the head of the project. I'm sitting here beside the project, guiding it from the side. Yep. Back in the back here.
How do you give and take criticism with your teammates? It's a very delicate process, and you sort of touched on, it's like a daily struggle. And
Whips, chains, total bastard. Total bastard. Unbelievable.
No, it is interesting though, and there are different ways. What's funny is there was a cartoon that I'm sure Warren remembers too that included me, Warren, and Chris Roberts, and our different management styles, and the pitfalls of each of them, and the insult to they were all insulting, and the insult to Chris Roberts was game designed by decree, which really was the way Chris Robert operated. In many respects. I mean, Chris Roberts, the good part about Chris Roberts was when he'd had the vision for what a wing commander was going to be, and he came and sat down and pitched it to us all, we all went, damn, he's right, it's going to work. I mean, he could describe it in a way that you just knew he was right and it was going to work. And so everybody, we invested in it because he was right and it did work. The downside of that is that when you went to work with Chris Roberts, you did everything exactly the way he said to do it, period, or you were fired almost immediately. No second chances. I mean, he was very explicit with what he wanted, and you either did it that way or you were not part of his team.
I literally heard him say, "Make that pixel blue, not green."
And yeah, I mean, so it was a place where only certain individuals could survive it. I mean, they had to be very talented, but on the other hand, they also had to be very subservient in their demeanor, if you know what I mean. Then there was the insult to me, which was games by democracy, which is that I was always the person, and I'm still generally the person, who can easily be convinced by whoever the last person is who comes to my office to tell me this is the way it ought to be. And so, I will be guiding this whole thing in one way, and then Paul Sage, our lead designer, will come in and go, "Oh, Richard, I've got to tell you, here's my justification for why this really needs to be this other way." I believe him. It sounded good to me. It was a compelling story. So I'll go start to push it that way until somebody else who sees it moving that way comes to me and says, "Hey, Richard, by the way, here's the pitfall of going that way. We should be going that way." And so I'm very easily swayed. And so that's my pitfall. And Warren's was games by Cuisinart, which was the scramble of here we go. And so.
I'm not sure it's a good thing, but actually I think I learned the democracy lesson from you too. I think I've moved more in that direction.
But yeah, so to answer your question, every team has a different dynamic, and there's different reasons they're successful or fail. I think the optimal team would be to have somebody who is as visionary as Chris Roberts really truly was, that was a little kinder and gentler. And if you could find that, wouldn't life be grand? But I've seen pretty few of those in the industry. Our industry, fortunately, I think we've grown out. Back in when Warren and I were working together, the games were commonly led by people who would kindly be called prima donnas. And they were powerful personalities who were very self-confident, who tended to drive and get things done. And their drive to get things done is why they were given the rope to go hang themselves with. But they were difficult to work with, difficult to rope in, wouldn't generally be team players, much less corporate players, but they were seemed to constantly bubble to the top of a team for some reason. But I think in the last decade, I think the industry has gotten so tired of prima donnas that they've basically been run off. And even on our teams recently, we've had mantras that we've spoken, out loud to everyone during the hiring process, which is, no amount of talent is worth any amount of ego. And so if somebody comes through the door that appears to have an ego that's going to be hard to work with, we say, we don't care how talented you are, we're not interested.
Disney actually, this is a quote from Walt Disney, "We don't allow any geniuses around here." It's true. That was true 40 years ago, it's true now.
Yep.
Alright, when RPGs came back from the dead in the late 90s, I noticed that there was something that they weren't doing anymore that they used to, and that was deep world simulation. I've never played another game that had the deep world simulation of Ultima VII.
Right.
Do you think that's ever going to come back?
I hope so. I hope to do it myself, amongst others. I find it interesting, like Ultima Online I think was a pretty deep world simulation too, although of a multiplayer type. But it's interesting that no one has done anything like that since. No one has chosen, I think the closest is in the solo player game with the Morrowind stuff, is I think the closest comparable that's come up these days. I find trends in our industry to be kind of interesting. So Ultima was mostly medieval fantasy, but if you look at the earliest Ultimas, remember I mentioned Ultima II had time travel in it? Well, in the future there were lightsabers and land speeders and rockets to planets and all kinds of crazy stuff. So it was, I personally am just as interested in sci-fi, a la Tabula Rasa, as I was in medieval fantasy. The reason why most of the Ultimas were medieval fantasy is because tile graphics was the limit of my capability. I couldn't really do 3D in assembly language very well. I just didn't know the math well enough to do it. And so the technology I could master was more appropriate to a more historical setting than futuristic setting. So thus I sat for many years. But it's funny to watch that as I remained consistent through a few decades of making medieval fantasy games, how my marketing departments and sales departments would constantly give me every other cycle counter advice. Like one year they would come to me and say, Richard, you've got to get out of doing this men in tights crap. No serious person is going to want to dress up like a little fairy and run around in their tights in this game. You really need to be doing something more futuristic where people can have guns and armor and all this kind of stuff, And I'd be going, well, thank you, but this is the game I'm making. Like it or not, this is what I'm making. And then there'd be other years where it would come full circle. Oh, Lord of the Rings movies are popular. Well, why aren't you doing only fantasy? Why are you doing anything called sci-fi? It's the things that are popular are fantasy. I'm personally a believer, and the same thing happens with like first-person shooters being popular, and so everybody dog piles on to make first-person shooters or role-playing games, whatever it might be. I'm a big believer that sci-fi is popular, fantasy is popular. Frankly, Wild West could be popular. What it takes to make any of those things popular is a really great property. And whether that's a movie or a game or otherwise, I don't think matters. What it matters is that it's really good. And so I think that any game you make that is actually extremely high quality will sell. I don't think genre or setting or play style really fundamentally matter at all. What really matters is that it's a great game.
What do you do to sort of fix on a particular setting? Does it have to do with some cool game mechanic that'll just work in a particular setting and not another? Like what goes into that process and settling on a...
Yeah, that's a good question. So here's the way I do it, and I'm sure there are other answers to this particular problem, but here's my solution. So when we sit down, with the Tabula Rasa, a blank slate. So you start from you decided you want to be in the games business. You're going to make a game. One of the first things is that if you don't make a game that you really personally are motivated to want to play, you will probably not succeed at making a good game. And so the first thing you probably throw off the potential plate is the games that don't, that you're not personally a big fan of. So you start with the collection of things that you're truly, your key leads are going to be passionately a fan of. Then you look at that kind of category, this kind of broad, there might be a few genres in there, might be first-person shooters, might include role-playing games. And then what I do is I sit there and go, okay, well, what are the key innovations that I potentially could bring to the table on this wide variety of subjects? And so, sometimes I literally do it with strips of paper. I mean, or you can imagine with sticky notes on a wall or something. And I will put, and this is literally how I did the language, but that's which I know is not a game design, but a similar process, where I'll put the ways I might approach the problem out on little slips of paper. But a lot of these slips of paper are not compatible. Like one might be for a role-playing game, one might be for a first-person shooter. but sometimes they are compatible. And what I do is I put all these ideas down, and then I kind of collect them into, like, well, if I did a first-person shooter in a medieval setting, how many ideas do I have that would make that compelling? And you raise up a little hill around that subject and see how, you look at that hill of ideas and go, is this by itself already super compelling, and I can see enough of it that I know I can fill in the gaps and create something that's great. And even if I can potentially, or it usually can't, but even if you can, you'll bring up a different hill that says, oh, if I do a sci-fi more role-playing game, here's the features that would pull together for that one. How does that hill look of ideas? Is that one a taller peak? Or can I fill it in better than I could with the other? And what I do is I keep adding ideas or throwing ideas off the table if I just think they've lost out compared to fresher ideas, until I've built a thought, this mound of potential ideas that are related to each other enough and complete enough that I know it has reached over a high bar of what it takes to me to be successful. And I can also see in my mind's eye that if I can't solve that problem, I at least know somebody around me who can solve that problem. And then off we go to make it.
Well, okay, let me ask you a question related to that. You said you want to start with an idea that you want to play. You don't want to make a game that you don't want to play. I pretty much agree with that. That's okay. So let's take that as a given. But is there something deeper? Because one of the things that I think sets your games apart, Chris Roberts' games apart, and other people, Sid Meier's games, Will Wright's games, is there seems to be a personal point of view behind all of them. There's something consistent about every game you've done. I can't speak to Tabula Rasa because I haven't played it, but every other game, I'm pretty sure I've played every other game you've worked on. I still haven't played 1, 2, or 3, but anyway.
It's all right.
But is it important to have a personal philosophy? I mean, I know there are certain things that I don't care how much my team wants to make it. I don't care how much my publisher wants it. I'm just not going to do it.
No, and I agree with that.
That are going to be in every game I work on.
And and
they're great starting points.
So I clearly agree with the recipe that has seemed to me to be the most prone to disaster is when a team chooses to take on something they have been given by a publisher. If you follow the guidance if a publisher comes to you and says, we really need a first-person shooter to compete with this other genre, how would you like to go make us one? I think that is very likely to fail. Because I think that you're given a target that is arbitrarily different than the skills and talent that you have in your team. And so therefore the probability of coming out in the top 10 is lower than if that alignment was perfect. And I think and I always think great games sell without regard to what the competitive landscape looks like. And so that kind of violates a couple of personal principles. That being said, what's interesting is that so I think that there's no question that the games I make all do come from a certain similar fountain of what a virtual world ought to be like, and I like them being thought of as virtual worlds and these big virtual experiences. And that's definitely a personal bias I bring to it. But then there's other people I look at, like Sid Meier, who, since you mentioned him too, who I think Sid is, and Peter Molyneux is another. There's a number of people who I admire in the industry who have the talent to be able to change genres much more significantly than I can, who can change game styles and platforms and archetypes to where you can still tell they're theirs. I mean, I still think they can leave their mark on it.
That's the key.
But they're still shaking up the base of their foundation of their skill, the things they're good at, much deeper than I'm personally capable of.
Okay, I see. It's that undercurrent of personal style still holds true for me, though.
Oh no, I agree with that.
Okay, yeah, that's the part that's the starting point for me. It's like, what kind of games do I make? Is kind of the starting point. I will never make a straight puzzle game. I mean, every time a team comes to me, I try to keep the focus on the guest. I'm sorry, but every time a team comes to me and says, we should just hard code this, don't simulate it, and just create a great puzzle. We can tune a puzzle. It'll be really great. We can create a boss battle that we can sort of tune and tweak until it's perfect. And I say, I don't care. That's not what we do.
Yeah, in fact, here's another way I would describe that same thing too. Like, I'm sure you can imagine if you get a job at a game company, like on Tabula Rasa, we have about 100 people in-house that are working on the game. And those 100 people, all after their tenure on Tabula Rasa, want to move up. And many of them means that they now want to run their own game, or they hope they can get to run a game, or they hope they at least can influence what the next game is in some significant way. And so there's, at least 25% of those people have probably created game designs that they have on paper that they would love to a chance to sit in front of whomever they could within the company and say, this is the game that needs to be made next. And my counsel, my disappointing counsel to a lot of them commonly is that unless that idea is something that happens to ring, to be parallel or generate excitement in some other key member of the company, like myself, who is the person to whom the company has decided to trust to make a game, that trust, since if you're going back to the origin history, the vast majority of times where you've said, hey, you're an up-and-comer, let me give you your chance to make your game, 99% of the time that will fail. However, so therefore the people who have succeeded before are the people are going to invest in it again. And so therefore, if you want to get something done, you really have to find someone who is already successful to influence or partner with, like I would even say our partnership was. Yeah. Warren's influence on me and my game creating was substantial and allowed him to go through the school of hard knocks in the process enough cycles to where he then could go off on his own and rise through the system independently. But the probability of, even if you were the lead programmer on a project or pick some other lead, the probability of being said, okay, you're up next, you get to go make your project independently, is still is very, very difficult. The company has there's way too many hypothetical great ideas written out in design documents. The process of making the game is so difficult that the idea is insignificant compared to the process of making it. And it's the journey of making it, which is the trick. And that really comes from the school of hard knocks of having done it over and over and over again. Yeah?
I have two quick questions about the Logos language, Tabula Rasa. The first one is, how important will it be, in the game? Because, I played the beta on my roommate's desktop, and, when I first opened the Logos screen, there are, hundreds of, symbols you've made. But so far, the only use I've seen for them is they're used in skills. For example, if there's a damage over time skill to an enemy, you need you need the damage
right.
enemy itself. Those logos is before you can use it. But will they be used?
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other uses planned? Because it seems like there's only maybe 30 or 40.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let me rewind from that and just talk about languages in general, and I'll get to the specific of Tabula Rasa. So I'm a devout believer in what I describe as the Tolkien game design philosophy, even though he wasn't a game designer. But what I mean by that is that I am an admirer of what Tolkien did with The Lord of the Rings, where he developed the history of the worlds and side stories of the worlds and characters within the worlds to an incredible level of depth before ever writing Lord of the Rings, which was a single story that happened to include all this other research and content that he had pre-created. And I believe in the case of, if you're creating a virtual world, that the only reason a virtual world is interesting and compelling is because it is also internally self-consistent and has a sense of reality, has a sense of history, has a sense of culture, has a sense of ethics, it has a sense of being real. And languages are just one of the potential stepping stones you can build along that journey. And so I happen to enjoy the inclusion of languages. But if you look at, for example, the runic language up in the upper left, you may notice that is mighty darn close to Tolkien's runes in Lord of the Rings. However, it's actually not quite the same. And the reason why it's not quite the same is that I went to the same source that Tolkien went to, which is if you go look up runic in an encyclopedia, you will find that. Or you'll find a number of variations on that. And that was just all a variety of Celtic symbol languages that were the precursor of the Roman alphabet. And so I went and just re-derived my own set, so it's 80% the same and a little bit different. But if you can read one, you can probably read the other. And but since it's a precursor of the Roman alphabet, it also happens to look a lot like English. And so if you speak English, which at the time I was writing the Ultima series, I only knew or cared about the US market. And so for a US English-speaking player, that's a really easy language to learn because it's just a letter-for-letter substitution for English, and most of the letters look a lot like their modern counterparts, so you don't even have to learn most of them, or 20 or 30% of them. And so to use that as the mystery language within the game for an English speaker is easy and great and added richness and depth that I was looking for. On the other hand, if you speak French or German, or worse yet, Japanese or Korean, this is a phenomenally difficult language because you have to first convert it from runic into the English alphabet, from the English alphabet to the English word, and then go look it up in a dictionary that goes from the English language to your native language, which means you're basically never going to learn it. And so while I felt it worked great in the US, I think it was a disaster for non-English speakers. And so when I started on Tabula Rasa, I was going, okay, I would like to include a language because I believe it adds richness to the reality of the game. And I said, but there's a game design goal I have, which is I don't want to favor English. I want this to be easy to read, whether you speak French, German, Japanese, or Chinese or Korean. I want it to be not only equally easy for all those groups, but I want it to be actually easy, if you know what I mean. So, and I wasn't sure that was actually doable. I wasn't sure it was possible to make a language that was easy to read without regard to your native language. But I also had a fictional reason, and that the story of Tabula Rasa originates with the story of the first intergalactic civilization that travels around all the planets that have life evolving on them, and they want to leave behind messages that if sentient life does evolve, that they'll be able to read. And I was going, well, that's actually the same goal as my game design goal, which is I want it to, if you speak English, French, or German to read, well, that makes it's sort of the same goal as if you're a Martian or a Venusian or an Earthling to read. And so I figured if I solved it for the game design reason, it would also be a good solution for fiction. And thus began another research project where I was going, okay, I don't know anything about symbolic languages, or which I empirically I knew that something like hieroglyphics or something might be a type of solution, but I had never really studied anything about hieroglyphics or other symbolic languages. So I went and bought a whole research library on the subject, which is another one of my shelves. And first I looked up Egyptian hieroglyphics, which turned out to be a total dead end. And if any of you are familiar with hieroglyphics, you might know that the pictograms, like if it's a picture of a raven, that has nothing to do with a raven. It has to do with the sound of the word raven if you spoke ancient Egyptian, which nobody speaks anymore. And that's why hieroglyphics were so hard to interpret, is because it's a phoneme of a lost language, and not a pictogram that means what the image is. And so that was useless. But on the other hand, there was something I could take from it, which was the cartouche, which is putting a circle or a boundary around a series of symbols to make a proper noun or something to mean. And I stole the cartouche concept from hieroglyphics for my use in putting numbers together instead of a cartouche, digits. And then as I did other research, I found things like ancient Chinese calligraphy. And ancient Chinese calligraphy was a complete pictographic language in its ancient form, but over thousands and thousands of years has become simplified and is less like the original pictograms. But if you find books on ancient Chinese calligraphy, you see a relatively complete language that was actually pictographic. Similarly, there are modern languages which have been made that are pictographic for communication with the handicapped. And what's interesting about these is that A, they're modern, so they're well organized. But interestingly, I actually think that my language that I came up with is better than the ones that these guys created, because the ones that I found to read about included things like tense and modifiers to the words, little kind of modifications to the symbol to make it more accurate, which I felt actually made it harder to read. That I felt that just knowing the root word was much easier to read and gave you the sense of what it was trying to say. And thus I began to create my symbolic language. And I did it with literally little slips of paper. And I would go, okay, I need some fundamental symbols, and I'd write them out and spread them out on the floor. And based on these fundamentals, I can get these other derived words. And I'd run into dead ends where I went, okay, that fundamental symbol is not diverse enough to help me make very much communication. So I'd pull up and trash whole swaths of this thing. And I spent 2 or 3 months regularly reiterating through my entire symbolic language till I had enough of it done to where I go, okay, while it will never be complete because it's a living, breathing language, and anybody that needs a new word in Tabula Rasa, I'm the only person who is allowed to work on the language because I'm the only one who kind of understands it, if you know what I mean, from a fundamentals standpoint. Although other people are now, the dictionary is complete enough where there's 2 or 3 other people on the team now who are pretty much caught up and probably could start inventing independently of me now and probably stick within the guidelines of the philosophy, if you know what I mean. But that's why I'm actually I'm very, very happy with this language. And for example, if you look down the left-hand column, I'll read you the left-hand column, and I'll bet that by the time I go to the second or third column, you can at least follow along, if not get ahead of me on many of the symbols, because there's only a dozen or two root symbols, and everything else is a combination of those root symbols generally for most words, although every now and then you have to invent a whole new symbol. But the top left symbol is two lines with an arrow going up and down between them. That means it's something large. Okay, so that means a bigness. So that means a long. And the little hourglass symbol is a symbol for time, which I invented a time symbol. I know it's look kind of modern, but I figured, look, any species that evolves on another planet, they probably are going to go through an evolutionary cycle where they use water clocks or sand clocks. So okay, so the symbol of time is constant for everybody. And the dot is before the hourglass versus after. So that means in the past. That says long ago. And the symbol below that is two people, which means people. But there's parentheses around it, which I use to imply possessive. So that means our. Versus if it was a single person with parentheses, it would be my, if you follow my drift. So long ago, the two little houses means civilization or community. Long ago, our civilization, that next symbol is grew. It's a little plant with growing. You can't really see the arrow in this resolution above it. Long ago, our civilization grew, and then that box is on top of the line, versus under, versus beside. So long ago, our civilization grew on that little dash is actually no longer in the language, but at the time it was a connector. Grew on a planet. The little symbol with a plus in it is just a planet. Which that parentheses is kind of again implies ownership. Equal with a dot before it means in the past, which was that symbol that shows a horizon line with a road going to it. You can't really see. There's a open circle at the end of it. That means a far, because that dot is at the far end of that perspective symbol. Journey, little feet walking. Into a box with an arrow going into it, the stars, three little dots. They're like little asterisks there. That's so long ago. Our civilization grew on a planet that was a far journey into the stars. Okay, so the next one is a little greater than less than is my kludge for a question mark. That means an unknown of some kind. So that's a question of time. That means when. So when our civilization was young, that's a little baby lying on its side. We looked, that's a little eye with some radiating from below it. We looked to the stars again, if you look at the little symbol for stars, and wondered, that's a question in your mind, when, a question of time, whether, I should say, we were alone in the universe. So you get it? So I won't bother you to go through the whole rest of it, but trust me that pretty much anybody who's played the game, or pretty much in the design team, anybody who's worked with the symbols, very quickly learns the roots of this language. And that was really the sum total of my goal as a designer, was to be able to put into the game information in the art and in the architecture that would be the true history of the game. Just like if you go read if you could read hieroglyphics, go read the carvings on the pyramids. Or if you go to Rome or Greece, you could read the pictographic things that were drawn across them as well. But I wanted to do it in a language, again, that was more what I'll call universal. And if you even contrast that to, say, like the Voyager spacecraft that we sent off into space. I don't know if you know about the gold record that's on the Voyager spacecraft. I think a total disaster. In that, for example, they put the word hello, a recording of the word hello in every language on Earth, which means it has no information in it and is randomly unrelated noises of every language on Earth. In my mind, so if you're an alien trying to decipher that, you're going like, what the hell is this? It's literally unrelated, there's no context for it. It's useless. Whereas a symbol that kind of might show, the position of the sun or the Earth in space is probably very useful. And so I just find it, interesting to see how other people have tackled this problem. And I personally think this language is quite successful, and that in contrast to the other works that I've been able to find, which are the best works I found were, again, ancient Chinese calligraphy and modern languages to communicate with the handicapped, I think that's actually better. So I think it was a big success. Oh, so to get back to how to use it in the game.
We have 10 minutes.
So I was actually quite content to just have it as not a game mechanic. However, we actually then discovered that we could insert it as a game mechanic in the way you do right now, where you unlock your powers. And yes, that will continue to grow because A, we're expanding the powers in the game to where those will continue to use more and more symbols. And as you explore through the game, you will discover there's more art and architecture throughout the game that uses a broader diversity of the symbols. So the symbols we're for sure trying to teach are the roots of the language so that you can struggle through figuring out the rest of it on your own.
Yeah, I guess I answered my second question. I was sort of wondering, if that
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, this is actually the history of Tabula Rasa. This is the story of the ELO that I wrote out in the symbolic language. This just happens to be a somewhat older, before I was completely finished with the language. So there's a few what I'll call archaic symbols in it.
I bet you could go on eBay and sell translations of that for real money now too.
Oh, and in fact, what we're doing
right.
now too is, a lot of the fan base likes to do things like write fan fiction and stuff. And since so few people on my team know the language and have time to write out the history of our game or write stories about our game in that language, we're running contests online for the player base.
That's awesome.
To write in that language so to save me the trouble. Because that way, I can just read through the 100 examples of what they think the story ought to be, and I'll go, that one reads right and sounds right. I'll adopt that one into the game. Back here.
So have you? This is launched in several different countries, I assume. Have you sort of tested that? How it works with other cultures, and can they also interpret what you've written as easily?
Yeah, so far it's out in US and Europe, so it's not out in Asia, which I think is the big test. It's not out there yet, but I did do testing prior to way even before beta, because another part of the problem of developing a language is sentence structure, where English is a different sentence structure than a lot of other languages. Like use Spanish as a case study. In English we would say the blue house, and in Spanish you'd say the house which is blue. And so even word order is different language to language. And so I went through a period of the evolution of this symbolic language of going, okay, do I need to find some neutral or some universal sentence structure to be able to put this in that is easy enough or equally difficult for all cultures to be able to read? And I knew that since any word order I chose was going to make it sound odd to somebody, I was just hopeful that it would not sound any more odd than, say, Yoda. And that was kind of my test study. Was Yoda's sentence structure is a little unusual compared to English. And what I found was that and Korean, by the way, happens to be more like Spanish than more like English. But what I found is that since most of us creating the game speak English, when we would try any word order other than the standard English word order, we had a hard time being very consistent about it. And it also didn't seem to make it much easier for anybody else to read. That everybody, word order is universal enough that people get that it came from another culture. And so whether you say the blue house or the house blue, you can straighten that out in your mind as long as it's used consistently. We found consistency was more important than any particular word order, and so we defaulted back to English. And I tested that. We wrote out a lot of stuff, and I tested it with we have lots of Korean employees, of course, at NCSoft, and so we tested it on a variety of employees to see which of these they found easy to read, and English turned out to be the winner. Alan?
From time to time in the past, you have hosted fundraisers for local politics. Do you yourself have political ambitions?
I enjoy, I've grown to really enjoy politics, I really do, and I enjoy involvement in the political game, you might say, and I've, grown up to, only in the last decade or so, so I've only grown up recently, to kind of see the compelling importance of politics, and so that's why I've become so involved, but whenever, and I now have had to, because I'm also a landowner and other things and a business owner, I've had to spend a lot of time downtown at city council and watch the process of government on a minute-to-minute basis, and I do not envy them their jobs. Most of the job of a politician is mostly listening to people complain and trying to find wrestle to the ground some painful consensus between factions. And while I enjoy doing that on a team of about 20 or maybe 100 at the most, I think doing it with a team of 1 million or 1,000 or anything on that scale is more work than fun. So if I could be a dictator, maybe so. But but I do respect and admire the process. I think it's really important. So I vote and I lobby and I support various people who I believe in. But I don't think I'll ever want to participate.
You also create social experiments that could plug into the political process if you provide the right game systems and the right goals. I mean, Have you thought about using MMOs for political purposes?
Not specifically for politics, but maybe you've seen this one too. But the DoD, the Department of Defense, is actually very interested in MMOs.
I'll bet.
Because they would love to run simulations. I mean, what's interesting about an MMO is that you change something like a taxation rate, and the ripple effect through the physical economy and the opinion of people in it is much faster than if you try to change it in the real world, where the propagation is considerably slower. And so as a place to simulate cause and effect, MMOs represent a very interesting platform. The DoD has contacted not just us, but a lot of MMO makers about doing things like, we want to run the simulations of this hot spot in the world where if we put the clamp on everybody and tell them there's a curfew and they have to stay in at 10 o'clock at night, how are people going to react? Who's going to buck the system? What are they going to do to buck the system? What kinds of deviant behavior is going to emerge if they clamp down some kind of rule? So I think that those are actual useful, potential applications. Doesn't happen to interest me again personally, but I think that the science of our industry absolutely has broad-based applications in social experiments like that.
Wow. So we have a little less than 5 minutes. I know there are other questions, but I want to ask you, maybe even related to that, a little bit about your extracurricular activities, which are dramatic and incredible, and scare the crap out of me. But does that feed back? Is all that zero-G stuff and going into space next year? Thank God you're doing it, man. You've been talking about it for so long. I'm really thrilled that you're doing it. Collecting strange African stuffed things that really do scare me. Does that feed back into your gaming? Is that all put together?
Yeah. So I'm a big believer in that. The same sense of exploration that we try to put in the games, where around every bend is some new thing to discover, is very much akin to what I like to do in the real world. I like to fancy myself an explorer, quote unquote. I've been to all 7 continents. I've been to the South Pole twice. I've been down to the bottom of the ocean 5 times, and at 5,000 meters or plus depth. Going to space next year, to the International Space Station. But if you look around at my house at those collections, for example, one of my main collectibles is an object called an orrery, O-R-R-E-R-Y, that no dictionary speller has ever had in it, but is the correct spelling of an object. And they're little mechanical models of a solar system. But if you look at the Ultima series, it always had little mechanical models of a solar system. And my house has an observatory on it, and you know what? There's observatories in most of the Ultimas also. And the movements of the stars have been fictionalized to be the movements of the Shadow Lords in Ultima 5 or so, 5 or 6. And so there's absolutely a direct connection between not only the literal physical objects that I like to collect and then they get physically manifested in the games, but I think that's really more just chance, as much as the spirit of this exploration and discovery, which is that I believe a major motivation for me in life is the chance to discover and explore, and so I try to imbue that into my games deeply.
And you may already have answered this, but what comes next? I have no facts here, and if you don't want to answer this, that's fine. But it almost feels like Tabula Rasa. You're going into space now. Have you made your last game?
No, I hope not. I don't think so.
What comes next then?
Well, what's interesting is somebody else was asking about solo player games, which I actually don't think that's what's next. I actually think next is another MMO. But what I find interesting is that Tabula Rasa, I believe, has really deviated from the status quo, I would like to think, from what I'll call the EverQuest model. But more importantly, I think that no one is pursuing what I'll call the Ultima model, which really I find odd. And of course, I've not talked with any of the team members about this thought, and I know that they will have a wide variety of radical different thoughts. But if you ask me personally, where my personal bias lies, is to circle back to what I'll call that sandbox, deeper or broader simulation that the Ultima series has had in it, Ultima 7 or Ultima Online, being kind of, I think, two of the key moments of virtual world creation for me, and really could do something that harkens back to those again.
Okay, I just thought of about 4 more questions. You used to talk about location-based entertainment all the time. Is that just not part of your life anymore?
No, I would still love to do that. So, you know, that's just something waiting for, again, an opportunity. I mean, again, if the, Mr. Disney, you know, I still have, in fact, I was talking with Tracy Hickman just the other day, who, as you might know, is one of the authors of the Dragonlance series.
He's an old friend.
And yeah, we used to cohort around at a lot of gaming conventions and such. And so he's heard me give my pitches for location-based entertainment. But I still have, you know, as you know, I do these big haunted houses and these big thematic parties that are often interactive for people to come participate in the physical world. And I would very much enjoy creating physical entertainment too. But again, this, in my mind, these all run together. These are all the same expression. The stuff I collect, the stuff I build in the virtual world, and if I ever got a chance to build it from a practical physical interaction, that would be just as motivating.
And really the last question, and then we got to cut this off, I'm afraid. You know, I've always said I would get out of the game business if I could make a living making music. What would you get out of the game business to do? What would it take?
You know, I actually think if you broaden the word game to include, you know, forms of entertainment that are not completely virtual, I don't think there is anything I would leave this business for.